As it says in the book Reading Dante by Giuseppe Mazzotta, which I personally consider among my favorite interpretations of Dante's poetry, and which serves me as a guide in making these videos, before beginning an exploration of Inferno, it is necessary to make some general remarks about the poem as a whole, its overall design, and then move toward the opening cantos. The poem is commonly known as the Divine Comedy, yet its proper title is simply Comedy. That is the name Dante himself gave it, and he did so for several reasons. The first reason concerns its ending. The poem concludes in happiness. It tells a story that starts in confusion and collapse. A catastrophe, one might say, as the pilgrim finds himself lost in a dark wood, and then gradually moves toward light, truth, and God. In this sense, comedy defines the poem's thematic direction. It traces a movement from one condition to another, and in doing so it stands in direct contrast to tragedy. Tragedy typically begins with harmony or happiness, and proceeds toward ruin or death. A second reason for the title is stylistic. Dante calls the poem a comedy because he writes it in the vernacular. Instead of choosing Latin, the language traditionally associated with philosophy and high cultural exchange, he uses the common Italian language. This choice also implies the adoption of a humble style. In classical Greek and Roman theory, there were three levels of style. The highest, as the tragic or sublime style, was reserved for stories about kings and great figures. Since style was expected to suit the subject matter, beneath it stood the middle or elegiac style. Finally, there was the low style, the style of comedy, associated with everyday speech and capable of absorbing all other registers. This is the style Dante chooses. Calling such a work a comedy, however, has a deeper implication. It challenges the idea of a fixed hierarchy of reality. For Dante, reality is not neatly divided into high, middle, and low realms. What is low and humble, such as the experience being narrated, that of an ordinary human being living around the year 1300 who undergoes the extraordinary journey of seeing God and then returns to earth to recount it, can become elevated, just as what is high can be brought low. The classical distinctions described in Aristotle's Poetics, a work Dante did not know, or in Horace's Art of Poetry, which he did know, are therefore misleading. Dante rejects that rigid system and pursues different aims in naming his work a comedy. As for the poem's formal structure, it is divided into three parts: Hell, Purgatory, and Paradise. Each section contains 33 cantos, with one exception. Inferno has 34 cantos, because it includes an additional opening canto. This first canto stands apart as a kind of rehearsal. It presents a journey that does not succeed. The true journey begins only with the second canto. The poem contains 100 cantos, yet the true organizing principle of its narrative is the number 3. It is written in a metrical form known as terzerima, a rhyme scheme that unfolds in an interlocking pattern, where one set of lines leads into the next. For this reason, 3 becomes the fundamental symbolic number governing the poem's divisions. The justification for this choice is primarily aesthetic and is rooted in a biblical idea expressed in the Book of Wisdom, which states that God created all things according to number, measure, and weight. The comedy seeks to reproduce the symmetry, order, and harmony that Dante perceives in the universe. The poem presents itself as a reflection of that higher, divine order and aspires to participate in it. It is therefore marked by a productive tension. It mirrors the structure of the cosmos while also functioning as a part that longs to be joined to a greater whole. These principles help clarify the patterns of correspondence that appear throughout the poem. One particularly important form of parallelism deserves attention. Although the poem unfolds in a linear sequence from the first canto to the 100th, its division into Hell, Purgatory, and Paradise creates internal correspondences among cantos. Certain cantos mirror one another across the 3 realms. For example, the 6th canto of Inferno anticipates the 6th canto of Purgatorio, and both in turn anticipate the 6th canto of Paradiso. The same alignment occurs with other cantos, such as the 10th in each canticle, and this pattern can be traced with considerable consistency. The poem is therefore organized along 2 axes at once. It moves forward horizontally, while also forming vertical relationships across its three parts. With these general considerations established, attention can now turn to the first canto, one of the most famous sections of the poem, which serves as its overall preface. It opens with the pilgrim at the midpoint of human life, discovering that he has strayed into a dark wood, because the straight path has been lost. The forest is described as wild, rough, and harsh, so terrifying that even remembering it renews fear. Its bitterness is said to be scarcely less than death itself. Yet, in order to speak of the good that eventually emerges from this experience, the pilgrim recounts what he encountered there. He cannot clearly explain how he entered the wood, having been overwhelmed by a kind of spiritual sleep at the moment he abandoned the true way. When he reaches the base of a hill at the edge of a valley filled with dread, he looks upward and sees its slopes illuminated by the light of a heavenly body that guides human beings along the right path. At that sight, the fear that had weighed upon his heart throughout the miserable night begins to subside. Like someone who has barely escaped drowning and, once on shore, turns back to look at the perilous waters, his mind, still in flight, looks back at the passage that has never allowed anyone to pass through it alive. It is a striking opening, remarkable for beginning in the middle rather than at an origin. The starting point is the pilgrim's present condition. He finds himself lost. The opening line contains more than it seems. When it speaks of being midway in the journey of life, it introduces the poem's central image. Life itself is a journey. This implies that human beings are always in motion, always on the way, even if the destination is not yet known. The pilgrim will soon come to understand where he is headed, but for now he is displaced and exposed to a series of trials and encounters. The journey suggests that one is not yet where one hopes to be. Significantly, the phrase speaks of our life, not merely an individual one, that possessive establishes that the experience is not entirely unique. It is shared, something that concerns everyone. All human beings are travelers on the journey of life. At the same time, the poem insists on an autobiographical focus. There is a strong emphasis on the first person. The pilgrim says that he found himself in a dark wood and came to himself there. As in the Vita Nuova, this will be a personal narrative. Yet here the self does not remain enclosed within private experience. Instead, the self looks outward, sees the world, and comes to understand itself through that encounter. The journey moves into a public space. This marks a crucial difference between the Vita Nuova and the Divine Comedy. The earlier work was bound to fail as a narrative because the protagonist remained trapped within the solitude and inwardness of his own life, detached from the concerns of the wider world. The comedy begins with a similar kind of collapse, a shipwreck of previous intellectual and spiritual pursuits that will later be described in detail. But from this point onward, it turns in a new direction. Traditional commentators often claim that when the pilgrim says he found himself in a dark wood, he is already in a state of sin, and that the forest symbolizes spiritual despair. According to this view, he is at a dead end, uncertain of where to go. Such an allegorical reading, however, may be too quick, since the poem itself has not yet provided clear evidence for it. What is certain is that the pilgrim is lost in a frightening landscape. He is enclosed within it, unable to explain how he arrived there. He knows at least one thing: he wants to escape. The text then stresses how difficult and bitter the situation is, almost as bitter as death itself. Yet immediately afterward, the pilgrim declares that in order to speak of the good he discovered there, he must first recount other things he saw. In a sense, the poem already gestures toward its own outcome. The narrative of being lost in a dense, savage, and harsh wood of night is interrupted by a forward-looking gaze. His vision cuts through the darkness, searching for a way out. He cannot yet see beyond himself, but he already signals that the good will only become clear after passing through other experiences. From the outset, it becomes clear that the poem operates with a double narrative focus. On one level, it tells the story of a pilgrim who is immersed in time, caught in a sequence of events and encounters that unfold moment by moment and that he does not fully understand. He moves within a temporal, diachronic dimension, experiencing things as they happen, often without grasping their meaning. For this reason, he will soon be guided by Virgil, yet even under this guidance he remains largely unaware of the full significance of what is happening to him. Alongside this perspective, however, there is a second focus: the poet who has already lived through the entire journey and now speaks from a position of knowledge. This narrator possesses a comprehensive, almost omniscient view and recounts the experience after the fact. The poem unfolds along this double axis, balancing the limited understanding of the pilgrim with the broader vision of the poet, who has become a poet precisely because of this journey. There is an implicit irony in the gap between the pilgrim's partial awareness and the poet's synoptic insight. Although the boundary between these two perspectives is not always rigid and they sometimes overlap, this tension provides a fundamental structure for the poem. The canto then moves into a second phase with the admission that the pilgrim cannot clearly explain how he entered the dark wood, since he was overcome by a kind of sleep at the moment he abandoned the true path. This state suggests a dullness or lethargy of consciousness, a condition in which his mental powers are inactive. When he reaches the base of a hill at the far end of the fearful valley, he looks up and sees its slopes already illuminated by the rays of a guiding heavenly body. Daybreak arrives, and he turns his gaze toward the light, believing that natural illumination will reveal the shape of the landscape and show him a way out of his crisis. If the poem followed a purely Platonic model, the story would end at this point. In such a narrative, like the image of the cave, one begins in darkness, seeing only shadows mistaken for reality. Salvation comes when one turns toward the source of true light and gains knowledge. In that philosophical framework, understanding itself is redemptive. Knowledge is identified with virtue, and ignorance is treated as a wound of the intellect that learning, education, and philosophy are able to heal. Dante, however, quickly discovers that this promise is insufficient. The reality he confronts proves far more complex than philosophical handbooks suggest, and the path to salvation cannot be reduced to intellectual enlightenment alone. As he turns toward the light, the pilgrim becomes aware of a powerful emotion rising within him. Fear overwhelms him, a passion of the soul that freezes his ability to judge and act. It halts his movement and leaves him uncertain of which direction to take. Still, the intense fear that had filled his heart throughout the miserable night begins to subside. The experience resembles a dark night of the soul, a moment of spiritual crisis reaching its peak. He then compares himself to someone who has barely escaped drowning and, once safely on shore, turns back to look at the dangerous waters. In the same way, his mind, still retreating from danger, looks back at the passage that no one has ever survived. This passage is saturated with language drawn from Neoplatonic thought. The experience is described as a movement or flight of the soul or the mind. It reflects the idea that certain experiences are purely intellectual, the kind that occur during acts of reading, studying, or thinking, when the mind seems to detach itself from the physical world and move on its own. There is, however, an immediate and significant shift that deserves close attention. Up to this point, the experience has been described as a shipwreck of the mind, a metaphor common to many epic narratives. One might think, for instance, of the Aeneid, where Aeneas is shipwrecked on the shores of Africa as he approaches the city Dido is destined to found, an event that leads to revelation and a powerful love story. For Dante, no such consolation follows. This is a shipwreck of the intellect itself, a mind incapable of determining either its present location or its destination. Yet as soon as this difficulty is recognized, the language changes decisively from mind to body. After resting his weary body for a short time, the pilgrim resumes his path along the desolate slope, carefully placing one foot below the other. At that moment, a leopard appears, swift and light, its hide marked with spots. The animal blocks his way and refuses to leave his sight, forcing him repeatedly to turn back. This sudden presence of the body, and the questions it raises about what the body signifies, marks a crucial difference between Neoplatonic narratives and Dante's experience. The body represents the limit of journeys based solely on intellect. The journey that lies ahead must involve both mind and body, because the body stands for the inescapable historicity of the self. It represents concrete reality, the passions, and the will. This distinction separates the classical Greek understanding of the intellectual adventure, centered on knowledge, from Dante's conviction that the deepest human problems are problems of the will. One may recognize confusion or dissatisfaction with one's condition, yet such problems cannot be resolved by knowledge alone, because they are rooted in willing rather than knowing. A simplified outline of the philosophical positions Dante engages may help clarify this point. One position, associated with Socratic thought, holds that all moral issues are fundamentally intellectual. If one knows the good, one will act virtuously. To know what justice is would therefore imply being just. Dante rejects this assumption. Definitions of justice vary widely. Some see it as an inner disposition, others as a family obligation, a civic responsibility, or a commitment to social order. Such definitions, however, do not amount to true justice, because knowing what justice is does not make a person just. Opposed to this view is a perspective centered on the will. In the letter to the Romans, St. Paul writes that the good he wishes to do, he does not do, while the evil he does not wish to do, he does instead. This statement exposes a fundamental existential conflict. The will is divided against itself. A person may understand what ought to be done and still fail to will it. This inner division defines the tragedy of human life. People often choose actions they know are not good for them or not the best possible response to their situation. From this standpoint, the problem of the will becomes central, and Dante adopts it as a way of confronting the limits of philosophy and purely intellectual knowledge. Throughout the poem, the will be addressed in multiple ways. Earlier discussions of the Vita Nuova already suggested that for Dante the will has a paradoxical status. Voluntary action matters deeply, yet some of the most profound experiences in life occur without being willed, as in dreams. The death of Beatrice, for example, was not something he desired, yet once she is understood as a real, historical figure of love, desire itself must be given direction. The will must be shaped and defined. Even here, at the beginning of the journey, the poem already anticipates these fundamental problems of the will. From this point onward, the poem begins to explore a wider range of problems, both as they concern the self and the inner life of the character, and as they extend into politics and a broader vision of the world. The world itself is presented as shaped by acts of will, as a projection of human desires. People and societies become, in this sense, what they choose to be. For the moment, however, the focus remains firmly on the will as the pilgrim's guiding perspective. The pilgrim soon discovers that he cannot ascend the hill he has glimpsed. His path is blocked by three beasts, a leopard, a she-wolf, and a lion. Prevented from moving forward, he is driven back to where he began. He falls into a state of profound despair, deeper than before, because now there appears to be no possible escape. At that moment, however, something unexpected occurs. As he retreats downward into the depths, he sees a figure appear before him, faint from long silence. When the pilgrim encounters this presence in the vast wilderness, he cries out for mercy, addressing the figure as either a shade or a living man. These are the first words spoken aloud by the pilgrim in the poem, and they echo the language of King David in the Psalms. By invoking pity, he places himself in a posture of humility and supplication. This Davidic tone will remain an important strand throughout the narrative, shaping the way the pilgrim speaks and understands himself. Returning to the scene, the three beasts have appeared, yet their meaning remains unclear. They may represent sins, or inclinations towards sin, but the text does not define them explicitly. What is certain is that they are animals, and as such they stand as animal expressions of desire, projections of human impulses. This is all that can be said with certainty at this stage. When the pilgrim then encounters the mysterious figure, it is not immediately clear whether the being is alive or dead. The scene dramatizes what medieval thought described as the land of unlikeness, a realm in which appearances and meanings no longer align. The pilgrim finds himself in a world where signs do not clearly correspond to what they signify, and part of his task will be to repair this rupture, to reconnect symbols with their meaning. The figure soon reveals himself to be Virgil, who will become the pilgrim's guide. He is known as the author of the Aeneid, but the manner in which he introduces himself is especially important. He explains that he is no longer a living man, though he once was, born to parents from Lombardy and Mantua. He situates his birth under the rule of Caesar and speaks briefly of his life and historical moment. This self-presentation functions as a concise autobiography, outlining his origins, his time in the world, and the meaning of his existence. Yet having spoken of himself, he turns his attention fully to the pilgrim. He recalls living in Rome under Augustus, in an age of false gods, and describes himself as a poet who sang of the righteous son of Anchises, who fled Troy after its destruction. He then questions the pilgrim, asking why he has returned to such suffering, and why he does not climb the delightful mountain that is the source and cause of all happiness, a mountain that leads toward Eden, where all things began according to the biblical vision of the world. The pilgrim responds with reverence and awe. He recognizes Virgil as the great fountain from which eloquent speech flows. His reaction is marked by humility and even shame. He praises Virgil as the glory and light of poets, acknowledging the long study and deep love that led him to learn from Virgil's work. He calls him master and author, the one from whom he derived the noble style that has brought him honor. This exchange goes beyond simple admiration. It follows a classical rhetoric aimed at winning the goodwill of the listener, yet it also signals something deeper. In praising Virgil, the pilgrim is not only recognizing a poetic authority, but is preparing the ground for a more complex relationship, one that will shape the journey ahead. Virgil, as the author of the Aeneid, is clearly the creator of a great epic journey. Yet this is not how he was primarily understood in the culture of Europe before Dante's time, especially during the 12th century. More than a poet, Virgil was regarded as a philosopher, and specifically as a Neoplatonic thinker. His poem was not valued chiefly for its narrative of Troy's destruction, or for the story of Aeneas as an exile carrying his father and guiding his son in search of a new land. Instead, it was read for its philosophical seriousness. The Aeneid was seen as proof that poetry could offer genuine philosophical insight. This interpretation followed the model that Neoplatonic thinkers applied to the Odyssey. Allegorists understood that poem as a metaphor for the soul's journey. The story describes a movement away from one's point of origin, from home, the place of familiarity and self-recognition, followed by a process of purification and return. Ulysses leaves Ithaca, experiences the trials of life, and must cleanse himself in order to go back, completing a circular movement toward his origin. The same framework was applied to the Aeneid. Writers such as Fulgentius in the 6th century, and Bernard Sylvester and John of Salisbury in the 12th century, interpreted Virgil's poem as the story of a human life unfolding in stages. Each book corresponded to a phase of life: childhood, youth, and maturity, including the temptations of the flesh represented by Dido. When Aeneas finally reaches Italy and prepares to establish a new home, this moment is associated with the 6th book. The remaining books were often ignored, since the philosophical meaning was believed to have already been fulfilled. In this way, the Aeneid was treated as a philosophical text illustrating the pattern and movement of human life. Its lesson was that all human beings, like Aeneas, are born into the world, and that through care and prudence they may eventually reach a promised destination. Dante reshapes this tradition by insisting above all that Virgil is a poet. He replaces philosophical assurance with the power of poetry, convinced that poetry surpasses philosophy. Philosophy, in his view, reaches its own limits. It cannot fully grasp the depths or the heights it seeks, nor can it truly deliver the enlightenment that promises happiness or safe harbor for everyone. Moreover, philosophy says little about the concrete reality and individuality of a single life. Poetic language, by contrast, addresses precisely these concerns. Poetry becomes a form of history, dealing with lived experience rather than abstract universals. When Dante calls Virgil the author of a poem about Roman history, he affirms that poetry and history engage with a contingent world, not with universal and potentially empty promises. This is the new understanding of Virgil that Dante advances. For these reasons, Dante calls Virgil his master and a great sage. Virgil responds with clarity and authority, telling him that he must take another road because he is heading in the wrong direction. This moment confirms that the first canto functions as a rehearsal for the entire poem. It presents a journey that fails because it follows the wrong logic. When one is lost, the instinct is to climb quickly toward the goal, to force a direct ascent toward what seems to be the destination. Virgil corrects this impulse. Dante may ultimately reach the same end, the realm of justice, the vision of God, the fulfillment of love and goodness, but he cannot reach it by climbing directly upward. He must descend first. The path requires passing through the full spiral of experience, through the horrors and suffering of hell, through the purifying labor of purgatory, before attaining the beatific vision. The way upward passes through going down. This reversal distinguishes philosophical presumption from the spiritual humility demanded by the Christian journey Dante must undertake. Only now can the true journey begin, and Virgil moves forward, with Dante following behind him. With the conclusion of the first canto, the poem moves into the second. At this point, a crucial question arises. When is this journey taking place? If the experience is meant to be historical, concrete, and essentially biographical, then time and place must be clearly defined. The poem therefore situates its beginning on the evening of Good Friday in the year 1300. Dante's journey deliberately mirrors the life of Christ, since he too will emerge toward the light of purgatory on Easter Sunday. Yet Dante is not immediately prepared to undertake such an extraordinary journey. He hesitates and questions why he should be the one chosen to proceed. Addressing his guide, he asks whether his strength is sufficient before being entrusted with so perilous a path. He recalls how Aeneas, the father of Silvius, descended to the world beyond while still mortal, and how Paul was granted a similar passage. But he then asks why he himself should be allowed to go. He insists that he is neither Aeneas nor Paul. These figures define the imaginative framework of the journey, Aeneas as the founder of Rome, and Paul as the apostle who carried the spiritual authority of the Church. Against these towering examples, Dante must confront the question of his own identity. Who is he, if he is neither hero nor apostle? The journey thus becomes a search for self-understanding, and also a test of whether his poem can bring clarity and a measure of redemption to the world. He believes in the saving power of his voice, though this belief is accompanied by doubt, irony, and the uneasy awareness that it may verge on pride. This attempt at self-definition is immediately countered by a reflection on the divided will. Dante compares himself to someone who retracts what he has willed, who changes resolve through new thoughts and abandons what was already begun. On the dark slope, reflection itself undoes the undertaking that had been so quickly embraced. These lines point directly to the limits of the will. Although Dante stresses the importance of the will in human action, he does not dismiss intellect. He understands intellect and will as two faculties that must work together, like the 2 feet of the body. To move well and safely, both are required, yet once the will is affirmed, its weaknesses become clear. The will can be divided against itself. It requires guidance and order, since it is capable of desiring anything at all. Finally, a person can never move faster than the will allows. One is bound by its strength or weakness. If the will is slow, fractured, or hesitant, the self cannot advance beyond those limits. Thus, when Dante asks who he is in the second canto, he exposes the first inner wound that must be healed, a will divided against itself. The third canto then brings a decisive threshold. Dante passes through the gate of hell, marked by its terrifying warning, "Abandon all hope, ye who enter here." Beyond it, he encounters the first souls of the poem, often called the neutral angels. Confused and fearful, he asks his guide who these suffering figures are and what cries he hears. He is told that these are the miserable souls of those who lived without either blame or praise. They are joined with the angels who, during the primordial conflict between God and rebellious forces, chose neither loyalty nor defiance, but remained apart as spectators. By beginning hell in this way, Dante presents what he considers one of the gravest sins: disengagement. These beings refuse to choose, believing they could wait, observe, and decide later. Their punishment reflects this refusal. They have no hope even of death, and both mercy and justice reject them. Dante refuses to name them, insisting instead that one should look and move on, for to name them would be to grant them a form of reality. Their neutrality has already emptied the world of meaning, reducing it to a spectacle for their own detached observation. He continues onward, and the next decisive action in hell is the crossing of the river on the ferry, where he encounters Charon, the figure who transports all souls. Dante offers a striking description of both the ferryman and the souls he carries. The dead are compared to leaves falling in autumn, dropping one after another until the branch is stripped bare. In the same way, the condemned souls cast themselves from the shore at a signal, like birds responding to a call, and cross the dark water. Even before they reach the far bank, a new crowd is already gathering behind them. Virgil explains that all those who die under divine judgment assemble here from every land, eager to cross the river. The image of the souls as falling leaves deserves special attention. Dante borrows it directly from the Aeneid, though Virgil himself had taken it from Homer. In the 6th book of the Aeneid, Aeneas descends into the underworld and sees souls waiting for transmigration, the process by which they will be reincarnated and return to life in an endless cycle. In that tradition, existence follows a circular pattern. Dante profoundly alters the meaning of this image. Virgil's vision reflects a Pythagorean understanding of life, closely aligned with Plato's idea of an eternal cycle of becoming. Individual existence is not ultimately unique, since death is followed by return. For Virgil, death has an elegiac quality rather than a tragic one, because nothing truly final or irreplaceable is lost. Life continues, much like the natural cycle in which leaves fall in autumn only to return in spring. Dante rejects this notion of repetition. He emphasizes instead the uniqueness of each leaf. Souls may be compared to leaves, but only if each leaf is understood as singular and unrepeatable, never to return once it has fallen. In formal terms, Dante replaces the epic idea of circularity found in classical literature with a linear structure. Human life is no longer an endless cycle, but a journey with a single course and a definitive end. In this sense, life resembles a novel rather than an epic, a unique path moving toward a final destination, whatever that destination may be. Yet almost immediately after establishing this linear movement, the poem enters a circular space. At the beginning of the 4th canto, Dante arrives in limbo. The term comes from a Latin word meaning edge, and it designates a region that lies on the boundary of hell rather than fully within it. This realm closely resembles the afterlife imagined by Virgil for the virtuous. It is described as a garden, one of several gardens that appear throughout the poem. This space anticipates the earthly paradise of Purgatory and even the garden imagery of paradise itself, where the heavenly Jerusalem is also portrayed as a garden. Such a place belongs to a long literary tradition often described as an idyllic or pleasant setting, a type of landscape common in epic poetry. In these stories, the hero reaches a peaceful, pastoral place where rest seems possible. It appears to mark a pause in wandering and adventure. Yet this pause is deceptive. Epic tradition repeatedly shows that moments of apparent safety are often the most dangerous. When the shade is cool, the water flows gently, and the landscape seems inviting, that is precisely when the threat emerges. The serpent appears when vigilance fades. These gardens are places of temptation, and that is exactly their role here as well. Dante enters this particular idyllic place and encounters the great poets, all of them virtuous pagans. He lists figures such as scientists and philosophers from the Greek and Roman world, yet they remain somewhat on the margins of the scene, without exerting much force on what unfolds. The intensity increases when he notices the classical poets, from Homer to Horace to Ovid. He asks who these figures are who receive such distinction, set apart from the others. Virgil replies that their honored fame, which still resonates in the world of the living, has earned them grace in heaven, and this is why they are elevated. At that moment, a voice proclaims honor for the great poet whose shade has returned. When the voice falls silent, four noble figures approach, neither sorrowful nor joyful in appearance. As is fitting for limbo, life here closely resembles earthly existence. In Dante's vision, the afterlife extends the choices made in life. Those who devoted themselves to art, beauty, and intellectual conversation continue doing so beyond death. If one believed that the highest good consisted in endless discussions of poetry and aesthetics, then that is precisely the form one's afterlife takes, sitting on the grass, speaking endlessly of beautiful things. Virgil then identifies the approaching figures. One comes first, bearing a sword and commanding the others as their lord, Homer, the supreme poet. Next comes Horace, known for satire, followed by Ovid, and then Lucan, the epic poet whom Dante will later honor again in Purgatory. Because all share the title spoken by the single voice, they honor Virgil as one of their own. Dante thus sees gathered the noble school of the poet of highest song, Homer, who soars above the rest like an eagle. The irony of this image is clear. Homer is blind, while the eagle is famed for sharp sight, yet Homer's vision is inward. His blindness signifies an inner gaze, a turning within to discover the subject of his song. Dante continues by recounting that, after some conversation among themselves, the poets turn toward him with a gesture of greeting, at which Virgil smiles. They show him even greater honor by welcoming him into their company, so that he becomes the sixth among such wisdom. Together they proceed toward the light, speaking of matters that it is better to leave unspoken, just as it was fitting to speak of them in that place. Here Dante inscribes himself into the lineage of Western poets, counting himself as sixth among them. Though he does not reveal the content of their conversation, it is easy to infer that they speak about poetry and its craft. Dante's imagination requires the reader to piece together what remains unstated. The setting remains a garden, marked by a sense of self-enclosure and self-absorption. This form of poetry reflects a certain spiritual condition, yet what is most striking, and what becomes the temptation for the pilgrim's journey, is Dante's claim to be sixth amid so much wisdom. The claim is unsettling. Dante is descending in search of redemption and humility, yet here his poetic voice elevates itself. A tension emerges between the downward movement of repentance and the upward assertion of poetic authority. This is Dante's great temptation, the belief that poetry surpasses philosophy, that poetry rivals history in authority. It is a form of pride, and it will be examined more fully later, since the next canto becomes an extended meditation on the dangers of such a belief and on the moral responsibility of poetic writing. In this way, the fourth canto reveals a fundamental ambiguity of genre within the comedy. The poem has been described as novelistic in contrast to the circular structure of eternal return and reincarnation that defines the classical epic, especially in Virgil. Yet Dante continually blends and unsettles genres. Each time a definition seems to take hold, he finds a way to undermine it. Canto 4 concludes with a miniature demonstration of the epic scope of the text. Dante enumerates the souls he sees in a manner reminiscent of the scene in the Iliad, where Helen counts all the Greek ships for Priam. On the enamelled green before him, the great spirits appear, inspiring him with awe. He sees Electra with many companions, among them Hector, Aeneas, and the sharp-eyed Caesar in armour. He observes Camilla and Penthesilea, and on the other side, King Latinus seated with his daughter Lavinia. He recognizes Brutus, who expelled the Tarquin kings, as well as Lucretia, Julia, Marcia, and Cornelia. Apart from the others, he notices Saladin. Looking a little higher, he sees the master of all who know, surrounded by a philosophical company: Socrates, Plato, Democritus, and Diogenes, along with Orpheus, Cicero, Linus, Seneca, Euclid, and Ptolemy. This moment functions as a kind of classical encyclopedia, gathering together all human knowledge. Yet Dante signals that traditional encyclopedias are incomplete. They never explain how one truly educates oneself or describe the process of learning. Epic enumerations such as this aspire to encompass the whole of reality, much like encyclopedias aim to do. Yet the intellectual reality remains that enumeration, simply by its nature, reveals the impossibility of totalization. There is always something that eludes the formal ordering, something left unsaid, which escapes the grasp of any comprehensive system. Canto 5 unfolds a drama that appears to be about desire, but it emerges directly from the crisis in the pilgrim's mind introduced in Canto 4 of Inferno. The experience of hubris, the celebration of one's own power and prowess as a poet, now meets the consequences of that pride. Dante will encounter, literally, a reader of his poetry who interprets it in a way the poet may not have intended, one of the most famous women in literature, Francesca. Before exploring this encounter, the setting must be established. Canto 5 takes place in the second circle of hell, in the broader region of incontinence. To understand this, it is important to consider the moral topography of hell. How is sin distributed? What is sin? For Dante, sin is located in the will. One cannot truly sin intellectually. The mind may serve as an accomplice, but sin resides primarily in voluntary action. Hell's geography is built upon this principle. The soul, in Dante's conception, is classical and Aristotelian, shaped as a triangle with the will on the left side and reason on the right. The point where these two faculties meet is called synderesis in the Middle Ages. This is the source of free will, where both will and reason converge, forming the beginning of moral life. Only when the will is free can one make choices and engage meaningfully with the world. Dante further subdivides the soul into three areas. At the base are the concupiscent appetites, the realm of Francesca and the other upper hell sinners, encompassing lust, gluttony, avarice, and prodigality. The middle region contains the sensitive appetites, the sphere of violence and bestiality. The top consists of rational appetites. Hell's order, its geometry and geography, mirrors this structure but in inverted form. Thus, the pilgrim begins in the area of concupiscence, the domain of lust. Here, reason is subordinated to passion, and pleasure is elevated above rational order. Even when dimmed, reason serves as a rationale for desire, as Francesca's story demonstrates. The landscape of this circle is one of swirling, spiraling souls. Dante's narrative carefully guides the reader through this movement. For example, as the pilgrim descends into the spiral of hell, he consistently moves leftward. By contrast, when he reaches purgatory, he moves rightward, signaling that hell is an inverted cosmos compared with the ordered ascent of purgatory. The landscape of this circle carries the weight of ancient symbolism, particularly the symbolism of the circle. In the Middle Ages, direction could be understood in multiple ways. Linear movement represented human life, caught in time and moving toward a specific purpose or destination. Circular movement, by contrast, signified perfection and plenitude, as in the angels circling the throne of God. Francesca and the other souls are trapped in a caricature of this circular, perfect motion, swept endlessly by their passions. The pilgrim, however, moves in a spiral that combines line and circle. He has a purpose, a direction, while still circling around the divine. Francesca and Paolo, in contrast, are condemned to perpetual motion with no aim, no rest. The principle behind this representation of desire is displacement, a quality Dante values and uses to reveal the ambiguity of human longing. Desire is displacement because, in this case, Paolo and Francesca achieve nothing. Yet it is precisely this lack of fulfillment that highlights the human condition, the sense of always being out of place. This recalls Augustine's Confessions, where the heart is restless and therefore unmoored. Dante's treatment of desire is embedded within this larger reflection on the disquiet of the human soul. Canto 5 begins with a series of avian metaphors. Around the middle of the canto, Dante describes a hellish hurricane, externalizing the storm within. It never rests, sweeping the spirits along with relentless force, whirling and striking, tormenting them without relief. He compares it to the way flocks of starlings are driven in the cold season, swept together in dense, chaotic masses. The sinful spirits are pushed here and there, up and down, with no hope of ease or rest. Cranes appear as well, adding to the imagery of flight and chaos. Dante then asks Virgil, "Master, who are these people that are so lashed by the black air?" Following these aerial metaphors comes an enumeration, a classic epic device. Epics strive for totality, seeking to include all aspects of experience, and enumeration is a key tool for this. Virgil begins by pointing out several queens, founders of cities, a detail that underlines one of the canto's central themes, the relationship between eros and politics, between pleasure and the city. The question emerges, what role does pleasure occupy in the governance and moral economy of society? Among these queens, the first is described as the Empress of Many Tongues, whose lechery became lawful in order to excuse her own transgressions. This figure is Semiramis of Assyria, said to have succeeded Ninus. The next is Dido, whose story Virgil famously crafted in the Aeneid. Dante interprets these figures as symbols of the intimate link between desire and political power. Rome, for example, is imagined as a reversal, a boustrophodon, in which the city's name mirrored spells amor, linking love and political authority. Venus, as the mother of Aeneas, reinforces this connection. Virgil's Aeneid thus functions simultaneously as a love poem and an ideological statement about Rome, framing the conquest and the city itself in terms of desire. Augustine challenges this conception of love by distinguishing it from mere lust for power. In his thought, the tension between lust and love is central. As a North African by birth, but a Roman thinker by culture, Augustine reflected on the great myths of Rome. This perspective is evident in the Confessions and even more in the City of God, where he contrasts the earthly city, Rome, with a heavenly city, Jerusalem. Rome, in Augustine's view, is driven by lust for power, no different from other empires such as the Persians or the Greeks. All are part of a continuous sequence of violence and imperial ambition. Dante shares a similar perspective, and his reflections will unfold along comparable lines. The catalogue of queens continues with Cleopatra of Egypt, Helen of Troy, and then moves to the medieval story of Tristan and Isolde. The inclusion of Tristan demonstrates how Dante interprets the heroes and heroines of classical antiquity through the lens of medieval romance. Even those belonging to epic traditions are filtered through the literature of desire. Dante observes, "And more than 1,000 shades whom love had parted from our life he showed me, pointing them out and naming them." This completes the epic catalogue. Dante's reaction is immediate. "When I heard my teacher name the ladies and the knights of old, pity overcame me, and I was as one bewildered." This marks the first explicit appearance of pity in the poem. By the end of the canto, pity will become overwhelming. He will faint upon hearing Francesca's story, falling like a dead body. This reaction is a mixture of sympathy, self-recognition, and confrontation with his own moral responsibility. Dante begins to explore the complex relationship between pity and justice. Does true justice require compassion, or can justice exist without pity? Is there a point where the two meet? This is the first meditation on pity as a moral force and as a potential reflection of one's own vulnerability. With pity stirring in his heart, Dante addresses Virgil. "Poet, willingly would I speak with those two that go together and seem to be so light upon the wind." He does not seek the major classical figures, but two ordinary people from his own world, from the region near Ravenna. Virgil instructs, "You shall see when they are nearer to us, and do you entreat them then by that love which leads them, and they will come." As the wind carries them closer, Dante calls out, "O wearied souls! Come and speak with us, if another forbid it not." They respond as doves drawn by desire, wings raised and steady, borne by their own will to a sweet nest. Among them are Paolo and Francesca, emerging through the malignant air, drawn with irresistible force by Dante's compassionate cry. The presence of Dido also recalls Rome's possibilities, the struggle between Carthage and Rome as competing visions of civilization, and the ethical and political choices that define human societies. Francesca begins to speak, "O living creature, gracious and benign, who moves through the black air visiting us who stained the world with blood." She had died at the hands of her husband, who discovered her and his brother Paolo in an illicit affair, which explains the reference to blood. She continues, "If the King of the universe were friendly to us, we would pray him for your peace, since you have pity on our perverse ill. Of that which it pleases you to hear and to speak, we will hear and speak with you, while the wind, as now, is silent." She then begins recounting her life and her birthplace, following a pattern seen throughout Inferno, in which narratives often open with the figure's birth. Birth, for Dante, signals the potential to alter the world's course, or, as in Francesca's case, to end tragically. Francesca describes her city in terms that contrast sharply with the tumult of the souls caught in the storm, evoking an image of stability and peace. "The city where I was born lies on that shore where the power descends to be at peace with its followers." Here she portrays a sense of order and calm that she has lost. She then turns to love, beginning 3 tercets that emphasize amour, love elevated to a transcendent principle. Love dominates her experience. Love, which is quickly kindled in a gentle heart, seized this one for the fair form that was taken from me, and the way of it afflicts me still. Love, which absolves no loved one from loving, seized me so strongly with delight in him that, as you see, it does not leave me even now. Love brought us to one death. In these lines, Francesca draws upon established literary traditions. The first line echoes Dante's own sonnet from the Vita Nuova, where he writes, "Love and the gracious heart are a single thing," suggesting that one cannot exist without the other, much as reason cannot exist without the reasoning mind. Francesca's use of this line flatters the author, aligning herself with his poetic sensibilities as part of a subtle, seductive strategy. The subsequent ideas reflect the rules of courtly love as outlined by Marie de Champagne in The Art of Courtly Love. These rules posit that marriage does not excuse one from loving, that jealousy is proof of love, that a period of widowhood follows the death of a lover, that no one should be denied love, and that love is always initiated through another's affection. Francesca casts herself as a heroine of courtly love, living in the realm of kings, under the rule of love itself. These literary and cultural references situate her entirely within the world of desire and social codes of romance, framing her story as one governed by love's irresistible law. Francesca's quotation of these rules carries a deeper meaning. Andreas, by formalizing love and reducing it to a set of rules, acknowledges that love is the most transgressive and disruptive of human experiences. Because it is so overwhelming, it must be contained, made part of a game, or structured as a socially acceptable ceremony. Francesca fully embraces this tradition, presenting herself as a figure utterly swept away by love, incapable of resisting its force. These tercets elevate love to a transcendent, irresistible power to which she surrenders her will. In doing so, she refuses to acknowledge personal responsibility, framing external forces, Dante's writings and Andreas Capellanus's The Art of Courtly Love, as the causes of her transgression. Her argument highlights her blindness to the reality of her situation and illustrates the defining characteristic of sin: habit. Sin, in Dante's moral framework, becomes sin when it is repeated, entrenched, and the individual clings to it, refusing to recognize alternatives. After recounting her reasoning, Dante responds with empathy and seeks more details. He acknowledges the sweetness of their desires and the tragedy they led to, asking how love first allowed them to recognize their illicit feelings. Francesca replies that no sorrow is greater than recalling happy times in wretchedness, but, moved to confess, she recounts their fateful reading. One day, alone, they read the story of Lancelot, and the narrative of desire compelled their eyes to meet, draining colour from their faces. At a single moment, overcome, Paolo kissed her trembling mouth. The story they read was Galholt and its author, yet they never continued the text. As Francesca spoke, Paolo wept, and Dante, overcome with pity, fainted as a dead body falls. This canto is fundamentally a story of reading. Francesca and Paolo read for delight, and the consequences of that act of reading are catastrophic. Dante raises a broader concern. How should one read? What are the moral responsibilities tied to reading for pleasure? The story Francesca reads, that of Lancelot and Guinevere, is itself a tale of adultery at court. Lancelot is the secret lover of the queen, aspiring, through desire, to supplant King Arthur. Francesca's actions imitate this triangle of desire. Like Chrétien de Troyes romances, the narrative begins on one of the major Christian feast days, Ascension, Easter, or Pentecost, where the heroes boast of past exploits rather than perform heroic deeds in the present. The romance parodies the heroic ethos, similar to the debate between Ulysses and Ajax in the final books of the Aeneid, which focuses on past accomplishments rather than current merit. The story explores the end of the heroic age, showing how desire and social structures intersect with the moral limits of individuals. The story ends with the secret love affair between Lancelot and Guinevere. When the narrative begins, the court is gathered, drinking and talking, when a mysterious figure arrives and abducts the queen. The knights do not move, and everyone expects Lancelot to act and rescue her, but he hesitates, fearing that his own secret affair with the queen will be revealed. This hesitation, this moral pause, symbolizes the decline of aristocratic virtues. A temporal gap emerges between thought and action, and Lancelot would have to endure public humiliation, exposed on the infamous cart of shame, before he could even attempt to save the queen. Chrétien's story, then, reflects the crisis of the city through the lens of private passion. The inability to distinguish between public duty and private desire gnaws at the civic order, and Francesca exemplifies this tension in Dante's canto. Francesca reads the story of Lancelot and, in a mimetic gesture, desires to become like the heroine she reads about. She refuses interpretative distance from the text, imagining herself as a queen, and she sees Paolo as a Lancelot figure. This mirroring reflects the imitative structure of desire described by René Girard. Between the subject and the object of desire there is always a mediator. In this case, Lancelot for Paolo and Guinevere for Francesca. Dante frames Francesca's story with the language of time, emphasizing the fleeting nature of happiness. There is no greater sorrow than to recall, in wretchedness, the happy time. Her account is marked by precise temporal references. One day, for pastime, we read of Lancelot, and later, that day we read no farther. Time itself becomes central to her narrative, revealing her deepest desire, to suspend or obliterate the flow of time. She longs for her moment of happiness to last forever, or she acknowledges that a single instant of joy may justify a lifetime of suffering. In any case, her passion violates the natural order of necessity and time. Through Francesca, Dante is confronted with the responsibilities of authorship. The reader has interpreted his work in a way he may not have intended, particularly in relation to the Vita Nuova. He must consider the consequences of his writing, the impact of his words on others, and the ways in which a story can shape desire, influence behavior, and even challenge the moral and temporal order. These concerns carry over into Canto 6, which continues the exploration of desire, passion, and the world of appetites. Whatever Dante has learned about human longing, about the workings of desire, and about himself as a poet, he now uses as the basis for new reflections in a more political context. He moves from the private sphere of the court and the intimate world of Francesca to the public world of the city, Florence, where incontinence is still present, but in a different manifestation. Here, the focus shifts to gluttony and its political implications. Dante enters the circle of the gluttonous, At the return of my mind, which had closed itself before the piteousness of the two kinsfolk that had quite overwhelmed me with sadness, I see about me new torments and new tormented souls, whichever way I move and turn about to gaze. The presence of the mind is significant. Canto 6 is largely about bodies, gluttonous souls who cared only for their appetites and physical desires. The mind serves as a counterpoint, suggesting that the sin of these gluttonous figures is a neglect of reason, of measurement. The mind, or ment, derived from the Latin mens, is that which measures, which gauges the proper measure of desire. In this canto, Dante asks readers to recognize the mind as a necessary balance to the relentless, biological appetites that dominate the scene. Whereas politics is often associated with the pride of intellect, here it is depicted in terms of the insatiable needs of bodies. Presiding over these political bodies is the mythological Cerberus, the three-headed dog, whose voracious appetite and multiple mouths reinforce the canto's themes. The landscape itself is repulsive, with endless rain mixing with filth and waste. Dante sets the scene, as the dog that barking craves, and then grows quiet when he snaps up his food, straining and struggling only to devour it. Such became the foul faces of the demon Cerberus, who so thunders on the souls that they would fain be deaf. We were passing over the shades whom the heavy rain subdues, and we were setting our feet upon their emptiness, which seems real bodies. The image powerfully conveys gluttony. The punished souls exist as empty forms, hollow bodies that only appear to be real. Their punishment is to remain perpetually unfulfilled, condemned to a bodily existence defined by lack and insatiable hunger. One of these hollow figures lifts itself and speaks. "O you who are led through this hell, recognize me if you can. You were made before I was unmade." This is Chaco, a nickname meaning pig, known in the streets of Florence. Dante responds, "The anguish you endure perhaps removes you from my memory, so that I seem never to have seen you. But tell me who you are, who are set in a place so grievous and suffer such punishment, that if any is greater, none is so loathsome." Chaco replies, "Your city," referring to Florence, and the phrasing shows that he sees himself as outside its life, "which overflows with envy, held me in it during the bright life. You citizens called me Chaco. For the ruinous fault of gluttony, as you see, I am broken by the rain. And I, in my misery, am not alone, for all these endure the same penalty for the same fault." In this exchange, the canto presents the sinner's perspective on the city, while Dante's position is still to be revealed. The central conceit of this canto is the city as a body. In classical thought, such comparisons usually correlated the soul with the city, but for Dante, Florence is depicted as a soulless city. The city can only be represented as a body, as a corporate, structural organism. This idea resonates with examples in literature, such as Shakespeare's Coriolanus, but Dante draws directly from a Roman source he admires, Livy. Livy recounts the civil war in Rome between patricians and plebeians, in which the plebeians, exhausted by labor without reward, secede to the Aventine Hill, paralyzing the city. The patricians send an emissary, Menenius, to persuade them to return, using a famous fable. He compares the city to a body. The hands labor, the mouth enjoys, the stomach receives sustenance, but all the parts must cooperate and redistribute to maintain the whole. Convinced by this image, the plebeians return, restoring the order of the city. Dante uses this analogy as a structural foundation for thinking about the city. But Dante no longer seems to believe in the city as a coherent, corporate structure. In the canto, the body parts are scattered across the city. The nails, hands, heart, beard, hair, mouth, each mentioned as if lying in disarray. This imagery suggests the impossibility of uniting the city's components into an organic, harmonious whole, implying that the body of the city cannot truly function as a single, living organism. Another issue raised here is the question of civil war, a theme central to Dante's political thought. Dante asks Chaco, "Your misery weighs so heavily upon me that it moves me to weep. But tell me, if you can, what will become of the citizens of the divided city, still Florence, and if any among them is just, and tell me why such discord has seized it." The image of discord is striking, a musical metaphor derived from the heart. The heart becomes the receptacle where all the jealousies tearing the city apart are located. Chaco responds, "After long contention they will come to bloodshed, and the rustic faction will drive out the other with great offense. Then, through the influence of one who is now temporizing, meaning the Pope, that faction will fall within 3 years, and the other will prevail, holding its head high and keeping the rival under heavy burdens, no matter how it laments or feels shame. Only 2 men are just, yet they are disregarded. Pride, envy, and avarice are the 3 sparks that inflame their hearts." Dante follows this depiction of civil strife with a street-level view of Florence, asking about other notable citizens. "I would have you instruct me further and grant me speech about Farinata, who appears later in Inferno, and Teggio, who was so worthy, Jacopo Rusticuxi, Arrigo, and Mosca, and the others who devoted themselves to doing good. Tell me where they are, and let me know, for great desire drives me to learn whether heaven soothes or hell poisons them." Here one should note the recurring language of gluttony: sweetness, bitterness, pleasant, unpleasant. This diction runs throughout the canto and links gluttony to politics. Yet where are these men of worth? They were devoted to the good of the city, but now they may be in hell. Dante dramatizes the tension between human judgment and divine judgment, the discrepancy between how these individuals are assessed on earth and the reality of their worth. They are lowered into the fire, weighed down by different faults. The metaphor of weight is extraordinary. It recalls the question of gravity. The weight we carry within us, the inner gravity, is love. Augustine observes in the Confessions that the rise or fall of humans depends on love, just as objects move according to their natural weight. A stone falls by its own gravity, fire rises by its own. For humans, desire acts as gravity, determining whether one ascends or descends. Thus, Dante's conversation with Chaco resonates on many levels, yet at its core it is the question of civil war, between Guelphs and Ghibellines, patricians and plebeians. Dante interprets the sweep of history, Roman, Greek, and classical epics, even the story of Oedipus, Eteocles, and Polynices, through the lens of civil conflict. In Monarchia, his treatise on a universal confederation of states under one emperor, Dante envisions the needed unity of all states modeled on the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire becomes the paradigm of political unification in his vision. In effect, he sees history itself as a relentless form of civil war. So harsh are his judgments on the realities of cities that one wonders how, or if, he can propose a constructive theory of politics. On this matter, Dante does not align entirely with Virgil, nor with Virgil's sharpest critic, Augustine, in the City of God. For Virgil, Rome is the providential empire, a power capable of unifying the whole world. Augustine, by contrast, argues against this, insisting that even Rome is part of a broader history of violence. Dante integrates these perspectives within the Divine Comedy, combining the concept of Rome, the necessity of empire, and the reality of civil war, what binds them together. Dante's response is subtle. Virgil is correct in affirming the unity of humankind, the Stoic idea of a cosmopolis, a world city in which all have a place. Augustine is correct in asserting that empire is built on libido and desire. Both are right, yet both are also incomplete, because their positions contradict each other. Dante contends that without empire, the world descends into disorder and lawlessness. Empire is the only remedy to civil strife, the condition in which a brother or neighbor can become an enemy. Augustine's response is inward-looking, retreating into personal solace, but Dante argues that such retreat is insufficient. The turbulence of civil war reaches even into the interior life. Thus, the movement from Canto 5 to Canto 6 in Inferno represents a shift from the private, interior world of desire to the public, external world. Dante moves beyond his own introspection to test whether the lessons of Canto 5 have broader validity. Canto 6, the political canto, demonstrates that no soul exists in isolation. The inner world inevitably intersects with the outer, and the outside world intrudes upon the interior. The framework for this engagement comes from both Virgil and Augustine. Virgil offers the idea of defending the empire, while Augustine destabilizes the notion of its necessity. Dante attempts to harmonize these visions and ultimately affirms the necessity of empire as the most effective, and perhaps the only, response to civil war. From the tumult of warring factions, Dante moves to Canto 7, the only canto without individualized sinners. Here he encounters the avaricious and the prodigals, represented not as unique figures but as collective, anonymous forces. Their sins take on a more universal character, symbolized by the counter-movement of Scylla and Charybdis. The canto also introduces the figure of Fortune as a woman, blindfolded, turning the wheel of fortune. Through this imagery, Dante illustrates how the avaricious and the prodigals can clash with one another, and reflects on humanity's persistent attachment to worldly things. Dante explains that God, for worldly splendors, appointed a general minister and guide, who in due time transfers the vain goods from race to race and from one bloodline to another, beyond the reach of human wisdom, so that one lineage rises while another declines, according to her judgment. She foresees, judges, and executes her reign, as the other gods execute theirs. Her changes know no pause. Necessity compels her swiftness, for men reach their turns quickly. She is much maligned even by those who ought to praise her, but she is blessed and does not heed the false blame. Rejoicing with the other primal creatures, she turns her sphere and delights in her bliss. Fortune at the wheel is a complex image, one that conveys both the inevitability and the impartiality of worldly change. How can Dante equate God with Fortuna? How can he invoke this pagan figure, Lady Luck, while living in a world governed by providence, where fortune is guided by divine intelligence? Fortuna may be blindfolded, but there is still a deliberate intelligence, a will, a deliberate intention behind the turning of her wheel. Moreover, Canto 7 begins with an allusion to the great war in heaven, the primordial struggle among angels that disrupted the cosmic order. In this sense, Fortuna for Dante governs only the sublunary world of corruption. She is a minister of divine will within the realm of the fall. But what can humanity do in the face of fortune? What rises inevitably falls, in the endless rotation of her wheel. People are always precariously poised, never fully secure in their accomplishments. Dante suggests that the only way to master fortune is to relinquish attachment to worldly goods. In this way, Canto 7 presents multiple strategies for reconciling the apparent tension between fortune and divine providence, while continuing to address the profound moral and political questions raised in the preceding cantos. Now Dante and Virgil move, and the reader moves with them, away from the region of incontinence and toward the gates of the city of Dis, where the pilgrim encounters a serious obstacle, an impasse. He cannot proceed further, the guidance of Virgil falters, and it becomes necessary to examine both the reason for this failure and the challenge that the pilgrim must confront. Within the city of Dis, in Canto 9, the first sinners encountered are the heretics, the heresiarchs, among whom Epicurus and the Epicureans are chief. This establishes a connection between the city and Epicurean philosophy. Dante, in a philosophical work called the Convivio, recognizes three schools of philosophy: the academics or Aristotelians, the Stoics, and the Epicureans. In the Inferno, he portrays the Epicureans as guilty of a form of intellectual pride, since heresy is understood as a matter of the intellect rather than the will. They deny the immortality of the soul, and this raises a question: why should Dante consider them sinners at all? In antiquity, Epicureans were regarded simply as one philosophical school among others. Dante's answer is that they are punished for their intellect, even though his own system places the will at the center of sin. The will is essential to the habit of sinning. Returning to the crisis of Canto 9, as Dante progresses in his journey, he reaches the gate of Dis, where he is confronted by the three furies of Greek mythology, Alecto, Tisiphone, and Megira. They block his path, declaring that he cannot enter the city, which is described in the manner of a medieval urban space. The city is built near a swamp, not for ecological reasons, but because in medieval thought such land was considered malleable and provided a convenient source of water. The Furies call on Medusa, who does not appear, yet they threaten the pilgrim with her gaze. According to the myth, anyone who meets Medusa's eyes is turned to stone. Once a virginal priestess in the temple of Neptune, she was violated by Neptune and punished by Minerva, who transformed her into a monstrous figure with hair of snakes, endowed with the power to petrify all who looked upon her. The threat is directed squarely at the pilgrim. Virgil intervenes, instructing him, "Turn your back and keep your eyes shut, for should the Gorgon appear and you see her, there would be no return above." The guide offers his protection, yet at this moment, a fundamental shift occurs in the journey. Dante continues, "Thus said the master, and he himself turned me round, and not trusting my hands, covered my face with his own." Then the poet interrupts the narrative and speaks directly to the reader. This is the first explicit address to the audience. The story of the pilgrim pauses, and the poet, sitting in his study, assumes authority. He says, "O you who have sound understanding, mark the doctrine hidden beneath the veil of these strange verses." The poet needs readers to constitute his authority and warns them to engage in an allegorical operation. One must learn to see beneath the surface of the language, for something is concealed. To lift the veil, the myth of Medusa is crucial. In the original tale, Medusa is overcome by Perseus, who rides Pegasus, the winged horse of poetry. Perseus uses the mirrored shield given by Minerva, and by looking at Medusa's reflection rather than directly at her, he succeeds in confronting and slaying her. In this story, the shield represents the need for mediated vision. Only through the shield can Perseus prevail and take flight. In Dante's allegory, the shield of Minerva becomes the text itself. The pilgrim is instructed to shut his eyes, and Virgil, not trusting him in the face of danger, covers his eyes. The poet, however, addresses readers and invites them to open their eyes. With the textual mediation, the shield of Minerva, we can face the allegorical threat of Medusa without harm. Following this, Mercury, the messenger and figure of interpretation, appears and creates a breach in the walls of Dis, allowing the pilgrim and his guide to continue their descent. Yet the deeper meaning of the allegory remains to be explored. Regarding allegorical technique, the Divine Comedy has often been described as a vision, and indeed it is, but it is also allegorical, in part. The allegory is intended to explain what the pilgrim experiences while lost in the woods, which represent a state of sin. Here he encounters three beasts representing pride, wrath, and other vices. Yet the initial landscape is deliberately unclear, part of what has been called the land of unlikeness. Within it, the pilgrim faces an uncertainty of signs. There are no meanings so transparent that they can be easily decoded. Dante signals this to the reader. The allegory is active, and the text demands careful attention. You readers, who have good understanding and healthy minds, open your eyes and look beneath the veil of the strange verse. The verses are strange because they require effort to perceive the hidden significance and to grasp the mediation at work. Allegory, first of all, means to speak otherwise. It is related to, but not identical with, the enigmas found in classical and medieval rhetorical traditions. Enigmas, irony, the practice of saying one thing while meaning another. Yet defining allegory in this way barely scratches the surface, because Dante has considered the issue with great depth. He explores it in several works, including a letter to Can Grande, written as an introduction to the first 10 cantos of Paradiso, and in the Convivio, where he investigates how meaning can be drawn from a statement. He asks himself, "I have a statement. How can I extract one or multiple significances from it?" Dante ultimately identifies two types of allegory: the allegory of poets and the allegory of theologians. The allegory of poets is essentially a fable or fiction. For example, Orpheus, who could move stones with the power of his words, represents how the poet's voice can edify cities. Orpheus also tamed lions through speech, which signifies that the ferocity within human nature can be partially tempered through music, poetry, and art. This is the allegory of poets. The allegory of theologians is fundamentally different. It requires a historical basis. Dante gives the example of Exodus, in which the Jews escape Egypt, cross the desert, and reach the Promised Land. These events occurred historically. The Red Sea opened, and the Jews passed through. In theological allegory, the literal level is historical and factual. Within theological allegory, 4 levels of interpretation are distinguished. The first is the literal, which recounts the historical event. The second is the allegorical or figurative, which teaches moral lessons. The third is the tropological, relating the story to the moral life of the individual. The fourth is anagogical or eschatological, wherein historical events prefigure ultimate spiritual realities. The Jews' journey through the wilderness toward Jerusalem exemplifies the soul's movement from sin to spiritual fulfillment. In contrast, the allegory of poets generally operates on only 2 levels, the literal and the moral. There are challenges in separating these 2 forms, because even theological allegory depends on words, and one must interpret those words to access the meaning. Dante addresses this by focusing on the literal sense. Taking the literal text of the Bible as the Word of God constitutes theological reading, while viewing it as a collection of extraordinary poetic narratives aligns with the allegory of poets. Dante resolves the distinction by embedding the literal sense in the I or me of the text. The historical sense is present in himself. He is the historical cipher moving through these experiences. The events gain particular significance because they occur within his life. The poet's fables are given truth value through Dante's personal and historical presence, allowing the narrative to operate simultaneously as allegory of poets and allegory of theologians. At this stage, the discussion has only addressed one relatively external problem, the distinction between the allegory of poets and the allegory of theologians. It is now necessary to confront what is really happening within the text, particularly the threat of petrification. In his youth, Dante wrote a series of poems for a so-called stone lady, Donna Petra. These poems describe an unrequited love, a passion so intense that Dante felt his intellect would be paralyzed, petrified by it. It expresses a despairing sense that death or immobilization might overtake his will. In the same way, the Medusa episode represents Dante's retrospection to a past experience now confronting him again, threatening him once more. He must purify himself and move beyond it. To clarify this idea and prepare the reader for the transition into Canto 10, a passage from the Confessions of Augustine proves instructive. Dante was well acquainted with this work and quotes it at strategic moments. Augustine's text is an intellectual autobiography, tracing a young man's fascination with different schools of philosophy. Augustine moves from Manichaean thought to Neoplatonism, engaging in rhetorical exercises and skeptical inquiry. He reflects on his love for theatre, and also critiques it, asking how a well-intentioned young man might react if he sees a maiden in distress on stage and feels compelled to intervene. Augustine's concern is with the role of the spectator, the engagement of the mind, and the moral response. Within this narrative appears a companion figure, Alypius, a Greek intellectual committed to self-mastery and reason. Alypius functions as a Sancho to Augustine's Don Quixote, an observer whose skepticism provides authenticity to the protagonist's experiences. Alypius travels with Augustine to Rome and then to Milan. Upon arriving in Rome, his first desire is to attend the games at the amphitheatre, but Augustine is horrified. He asks, "How can an intellectual wish to watch as human beings are thrown to beasts for the amusement of crowds?" Alypius attempts to justify himself. He promises that he will avert his eyes at the crucial moment, refusing to witness the violence directly. Yet, as in all human experience, the question remains whether such control will actually hold in practice. A scholar of Romance philology, Eric Auerbach, reflected on this scene in Augustine in his book Mimesis, though he did not link it directly to Dante. Auerbach argued that the story marks the end of Hellenic rationalism. To understand its relevance, the episode itself bears consideration. Alypius had gone ahead to Rome to study law, but he was carried away by an overwhelming eagerness to see the gladiatorial games. Although he detested such spectacles, one day he was met by acquaintances and fellow students returning from dinner. They forcibly brought him, despite his protests, into the amphitheatre during the deadly games. Alypius resisted, declaring that while they could bring his body there, they could not force his mind or eyes to follow. He would remain absent in spirit, overcoming both them and the spectacle. Yet they persisted, perhaps wishing to test his resolve. Once inside, the games began, and Alypius closed his eyes, forbidding his mind to follow such evils. But as a combatant fell, the cry of the crowd struck him so strongly that curiosity overcame him. Against his will, he opened his eyes and was wounded in his soul far more deeply than the combatant was in the body. He became, in effect, part of the throng he had intended to resist, intoxicated by the violence and caught up in the spectacle. Only through divine intervention was he plucked from this frenzy, learning to place his trust not in himself but in God. In Augustine's narrative, the meaning is clear. It illustrates the failure of the mind to master the will. It is a story about the weakness of human will, about pride, the belief that one can resist temptation by oneself, and about the peril of yielding to desire. This is precisely what Dante dramatizes in Canto 9. The canto depicts not only the failure of intellect, as seen in the moment when Virgil cannot fully guide the pilgrim, but also the vulnerability of the will, both as a past event and as a threat that could recur. After the previous scene, the passage to the city continues, and the pilgrim enters the city of Dis, encountering the Epicureans, those who deny the immortality of the soul. The Epicureans require some clarification. There are two types, commonly. One thinks of the vulgar Epicureans, devoted to bodily pleasures and the indulgence of food. Dante had already dramatized this kind in Canto 6 with Chaco, whose very name means pig. But in Canto 10, he presents the noble Epicureans, those who pursue intellectual pleasures, the joys of conversation, friendship, and reflection. They retire to gardens to cultivate the soul and their own intellectual pursuits. These are the philosophical Epicureans, distinct from the base kind devoted solely to bodily gratifications. Yet, personal pleasure remains central to Epicurean ethics. Virgil explains, "In this part, Epicurus with all his followers, who make the soul die with the body, have their burial place. The punishment fits the sin perfectly. Since they denied the soul's immortality, they are entombed, dead forever. Their sarcophagi serve as eternal reminders of their disbelief." Unlike some punishments in hell, here the correspondence between sin and consequence is strikingly appropriate. Virgil adds, "Therefore, to the question which you ask me, you shall soon have satisfaction here within, and also to the wish which you hold from me." Before further explanation can follow, Dante is interrupted, pulled back into the unfolding events of hell. At this point, the discussion shifts from the immortality of the soul to the political consequences of that belief. The focus moves from bodies and cities, as in Inferno 6, to souls and cities. The questions arise. Is a city without souls livable? How do its inhabitants relate? What is the structure of civic life when spiritual awareness is absent? Dante begins to probe these questions. He singles out two souls for inquiry, one Guelph and one Ghibelline, reflecting the civil strife of Florence. Farinata, a Ghibelline, and the elder Cavalcanti, a Guelph, occupy tombs, ignoring one another and their respective worries and passions. Their positions in hell symbolically depict a city where individuals prioritize their own concerns over collective harmony. The scene enacts a microcosm of Florence around the year 1300. The canto itself is marked by interruptions, as one soul begins to speak only to be silenced by the other, emphasizing the fractured, self-absorbed nature of civic life in both the living city and the city beyond. Virgil and Dante are first interrupted by Farinata, who emerges from his tomb, visible from the navel up, and says, "O Tuscan, who go alive through the city of fire speaking thus modestly, may it please you to stop in this place. Your speech clearly shows you a native of that noble fatherland to which I perhaps did too much harm." The depiction of Farinata from the navel up has a historical resonance. When Dante visited Rome, he could have seen the Church of the Holy Cross in Jerusalem, built with stones brought from Jerusalem by Constantine's mother, Helena. In the church's basement, opened only around Easter, a mosaic showed Christ rising from the navel up. Farinata's partial appearance serves as an ironic counterpoint to the belief in the resurrection, a visual commentary on disbelief, highlighting the contradictions Dante wants to evoke. A significant exchange follows between Dante and Farinata, centering on who defeated whom in the ongoing battles between Guelphs and Ghibellines, and Dante notes that his family took revenge when the time came, implying more may follow. Their discussion is interrupted again, this time by the elder Cavalcanti. The old man appears, visible to the chin, and rising perhaps on his knees, searches for Dante as if expecting someone to be with him. He weeps and asks, "If you go through this blind prison by reason of high genius, where is my son, and why is he not with you?" The reference is to Dante's best friend, Guido, whose name suggests guidance. The father hopes his son will continue to guide Dante as he had during the poet's early experiments in Florence. In this encounter, Farinata concerns himself with his ancestors, while Cavalcanti worries for his son. Both, despite their Epicurean beliefs, show an awareness of dynastic continuity and a sense of self extended beyond personal concerns. Dante replies, "I come not of myself. He who waits yonder, whom perhaps your Guido had in disdain, is leading me through here." He explains that he understood the father's concern from the punishment and words of the soul before him. Cavalcanti, noting Dante's use of the past tense, "he had," misinterprets it as a sign that his son is dead, exclaiming, "He had, does he not still live? Does the sweet light not strike his eyes?" When Dante hesitates to answer, the father falls back, disappearing from view. Yet the conversation lingers in its significance. Farinata, by contrast, remains focused on political matters, recounting the continuous back and forth of the Florentine Civil War. He speaks only of Guelphs and Ghibellines, leaving Dante to reassure the elder Cavalcanti himself that Guido is still alive, though in Dante's time the friend would soon pass away. The story of political disarray in Florence and the memory of Dante's friend raises deep questions about personal responsibility and the consequences of intellectual choices. One of Dante's earliest and most difficult decisions was to banish Guido Cavalcanti from Florence, believing that Guido had caused unrest in the city. Guido went into exile and never returned, dying 3 months later in the swamps of Liguria, just north of Tuscany. Dante carries a sense of personal guilt about this event. He does not speak of it openly, yet the guilt informs his relationship with Guido, which becomes central to understanding the canto. Guido is identified as an Averroist. Averroes, mentioned by Dante in Limbo, was an Arab philosopher and a celebrated commentator on Aristotle. In the Middle Ages, scholars often studied Aristotle by following such commentators, especially for challenging works like On the Soul. Averroes argued that Aristotle did not believe in the immortality of the soul. This view was contested by Aquinas and others, but Guido followed Averroes' interpretation. Thus, among the heretics in the narrative is not only the elderly figures, but also Guido himself. Heresy, in this context, is primarily an intellectual matter. The Greek root of the word heresis means to choose. A heretic is someone who exercises a deliberate intellectual choice. To be considered a sinner, pride must accompany the belief. Guido is held accountable for propagating Averroism, a philosophy asserting that humans are not intrinsically capable of continuous thought. We are primarily beings driven by desire and sensation. Rationality occurs intermittently, allowing moments of contemplation that temporarily detach us from ordinary life. Most of the time, humans live like animals, eating, drinking, sleeping, only occasionally achieving abstract, reflective thought. In this way, Averroism frames human existence as more reactive than contemplative, more instinctive than self-directed. Guido's philosophical views also inform his poetry. One of his most renowned works, A Lady Asks Me, presents a fictional scenario in which a woman questions the poet about the nature of love. She finds the discourse of poets on love confusing and asks for clarification. Guido responds with a detailed exposition, examining love's nature, functions, and effects almost scholastically, case by case. He asserts that love is a passion born of Mars, not Venus, implying that love is inherently conflictual and chaotic rather than harmonious and orderly. He portrays love as capable of death and mental delirium, offering a stark and unsettling vision of love to the curious woman. In Canto 10, Dante links the Cavalcantian ideas of love with the realities of civil war, showing a strict and necessary correlation between them. He positions himself in opposition to Guido Cavalcanti's view of love. In the Vita Nuova, Dante portrays Beatrice as a guide to God and divine knowledge, suggesting that knowledge of God is attained not through truth alone, but through love, through contemplating love itself. For Dante, civil disorder, the violence of civil war, is a concrete manifestation of the Averroist philosophy of Guido Cavalcanti. The canto thus has a dual focus, love and politics, and the imaginative connection between the two, a connection that the Averroists themselves would deny. With Canto 11, Dante contrasts the chaos of the city with the rational order that governs hell. Even evil, he suggests, has a logic. Hell is divided into three sections: the sins of incontinence, the sins of violence, and the sins of fraud. Fraud, Dante notes, is uniquely human because it combines both the will and premeditation of the mind, showing the conjunction of deliberate intellect with deliberate wrongdoing. The canto concludes with a question about Aristotle's ethics, prompting Dante to seek further explanation from Virgil. Dante expresses admiration for the guidance he receives, a clarity that pleases him both in questioning and in knowledge. He then asks Virgil about usury. Virgil responds that philosophy demonstrates how nature proceeds according to divine intellect, and that human art should follow nature as a pupil follows a master, making human art a kind of grandchild of God. Usurers, by taking a different path, violate this natural order, placing their hope elsewhere and contemning both nature and its divine order. Dante interprets art as work. In Genesis, Adam's expulsion from Eden frames work not as punishment but as an ascetic exercise, a way to transform the wilderness into paradise. Similarly, Dante sees work as a disciplined effort through which humans can cultivate order and virtue. Art in the medieval context, particularly in scholastic thought, is understood as a virtue of the practical intellect, concerned with doing or making. The practical intellect differs from the speculative intellect, which engages with abstract ideas, such as justice or the immortality of the soul. Whereas the speculative intellect contemplates, the practical intellect acts and produces. In this sense, art has its own reality, independent of whether it conveys truth. It exists as a made thing, governed by its own laws and rigor. Dante's emphasis on practical intellect highlights the work of making as a disciplined, creative act, a means of ordering the world, shaping human experience, and harmonizing effort with divine reason. In Virgil's explanation of usury, Dante's understanding of art becomes clearer through metaphor. At first glance, it might seem that he is advocating a mimetic idea of art, suggesting that art simply imitates nature. Yet a closer look reveals a more complex conception. Virgil says, "Your art, as far as it can, follows her, as the pupil does his master, so that your art is as it were grandchild to God. Art follows nature, which is a child of God, and so art becomes a grandchild of God," a metaphor emphasizing fecundity and generation. This explains why Dante contrasts art with usury. Usury is sterile, producing only symbols, money from money, while art is productive, generative, and alive. Art, in Dante's view, embodies a kind of spiritual fertility. The second metaphor, the pupil following the master, is equally significant. Dante places himself in the role of the pupil, with Virgil as the master, highlighting the educational aspect of art. Art teaches, leading humans out of ignorance, barbarity, and darkness. Its role is not mimetic in the sense of copying reality, but productive. It mirrors the rhythms of creation itself. Dante envisions an art open to beginnings, to life, rooted in Genesis, where contemplation of origins is necessary to understand endings and achieve one's ultimate goals. From Canto 9 to Canto 11, Dante moves from examining the pride of the mind, the vulnerability of intellect and weakness of the will, to articulating an idea of art. Art, for Dante, is also a remedy for human failings. If humans apply to themselves the same care, rigor, and disciplined attention with which an artist creates a work, the cultivation of the soul can begin. In this way, Dante presents art as an ascetic exercise, a structured practice through which humans can resist infernal disorder and move towards spiritual growth. From Canto 12 to Canto 16, the journey remains in the middle region of hell, the area of violence, which Dante also calls the region of bestiality. It lies between the area of incontinence, explored in the previous cantos, and the region of malice. One striking feature of this part of the Inferno is the prevalence of hybrid figures as symbols. The Minotaur and the Centaurs in Canto 12, the Harpies, filthy, foul monsters with the faces of women devouring trees and foliage, in Canto 13, and other emblems of doubleness scattered throughout this section. These figures carry significance as Neoplatonic symbols, representing the doubleness inherent in human beings, the capacity to encompass both the human and the bestial within oneself. In Neoplatonic thought, humans are seen as neutral or copular entities with the potential to ascend toward reason or descend into bestiality. Their place on the ladder of being is indeterminate. By contrast, in the 12th century, the prevailing view held that certain creatures were permanently fixed, containing these dual impulses within themselves. Dante, however, seems aware that these symbolic figures cannot fully capture the nature of human beings. Humans can redeem themselves, alter their state, or fall further into corruption. Symbols point to possibilities, but they are not absolute truths about human potential. In Canto 12, Dante situates tyrants, though the canto lacks towering personalities. Tyrants of past and present, such as Dionysius of Syracuse, Alexander, and Ezzelino of Padua, are named, yet they are placed alongside figures like Chiron, the centaur educator. This juxtaposition carries irony. Immediately following the exemplary portrayal of Virgil's teaching in Canto 11, Dante contrasts it with what he sees as the tyranny of certain forms of instruction, teaching that restricts freedom, much like the hybrid creatures themselves, which exist in a perpetual state between man and beast. For Dante, education must allow the freedom to move toward rationality or toward its opposite. This tension between constraint and liberty, reason and bestiality, forms the central concern of Canto 12. Canto 13 is one of the most striking cantos of the Inferno. It is the canto of the suicides, where Dante encounters a well-known poet from the mid-13th century named Pier del Vigna. Throughout the canto, Dante plays on the dual meaning of the name. The soul envisions himself as a figure of Peter, the keeper of the two keys of the kingdom, a symbol of power, while the surname, del Vigna, or of the vineyards, evokes the earthly, natural element. The canto presents the metamorphosis of a human being into a plant, illustrating the punishment for violence against oneself in the story of the suicides. The canto begins in a wood, which was not marked by any path, evoking the same sense of disorientation found in Canto 1. This place of confusion mirrors the inner loss of self that underlies the act of suicide, a disruption of the self, of what one is or should be. Dante then shifts to a depiction of the natural landscape, using a highly distinctive style. He employs antitheses and repeated negative constructions, or negative anaphoras. No green leaves, but of dusky hue, no smooth boughs, but gnarled and warped. No fruits were there, but thorns with poison. These wild beasts that hate-tilled lands between Cesena and Corneto do not have thickets so rough or dense. The technique, called privatio, emphasizes what is lacking rather than what is present. By repeatedly removing positive descriptions, Dante draws attention to absence and loss, encouraging reflection on what the world might be rather than what it is. Who inhabits this barren, cursed land? The foul harpies, hybrid creatures from classical mythology, take residence here. These monsters, part human, part bird, with broad wings, human necks and faces, clawed feet and feathered bellies, make lamentations on the strange trees, echoing the Trojans' encounter with them in the Strophades. This world of negation and monstrosity dramatizes both punishment and the unnatural inversion of human life. The canto also frames an essential debate between Dante and Virgil. What does metamorphosis mean? What is nature? How should human beings relate to it? In this section, their perspectives sharply diverge. The suicide's transformation into trees raises profound questions about the relationship between human will, human violence, and the natural order, making this canto a meditation not only on punishment but also on the limits and possibilities of human existence within the cosmos. The scene Dante recalls echoes Book 3 of the Aeneid, where Polydorus, a cousin of Aeneas, has been killed. Aeneas arrives in Thracia, in Asia Minor, believing that this is the land assigned to him by the gods. He proceeds to consecrate the ground by building an altar and purifying it with fire, as is required for founding a city. While plucking a bough, he hears a mysterious voice that startles him. The voice belongs to Polydorus, now transformed into a speaking tree, who recounts that he was murdered because of sacrilege, the greed for the gold he carried. Polydorus asks only for a proper burial, so that he can descend peacefully into Hades. Aeneas complies, realizing that such a place, stained by crime, cannot serve as the foundation for a new city. Virgil, the master and creator of that scene, encourages Dante to observe carefully. He notes that Dante is in the second ring of hell, and will remain there until reaching the dreadful sand. "Look well, therefore, and you shall see things that would make my words incredible," he says, reminding Dante that he has seen, in imagination at least, some of what Dante is about to witness. Virgil's authority stems from this foresight, yet he also humbly acknowledges that Dante's experiences will surpass his own ability to recount them. In this way, Virgil models a tempered form of teaching, a subtle correction to the rigid claims about instruction made in Canto 12. Dante then describes his own experience. "I heard wailings uttered on every side, and saw no one who made them. Wherefore, all bewildered, I stopped." Here, Dante introduces a complex rhetorical play, what might be called amplification. I believed that he believed that I believed. This layering of belief dramatizes the isolation of Dante's consciousness, emphasizing that there is no true conversation with Virgil at this moment. He is alone with his thoughts, trying to interpret what he perceives. The voices seem to come from hidden people among the trunks, and Virgil instructs him. If he breaks a branch from one of these plants, the thoughts within will be abruptly cut short. Dante stretches forth his hand and plucks a twig from a great thorn bush, and the stub cries out. This action mirrors closely the opening of Book 3 of the Aeneid, compelling Virgil to intervene in a scene he himself once imagined. "If he, O wounded spirit, had been able to believe before what he had never seen save in my verses, he would not have stretched forth his hand against you," Virgil remarks. Yet the extraordinary nature of the situation compels Dante's action. Virgil instructs Polydorus to reveal his identity, so that Dante may, in some measure, restore his fame in the world above, a world where, ironically, true restoration is impossible. The scene underscores the unnaturalness of this infernal realm, where growth and change are denied, and even the act of remembering or reviving fame is shadowed by the impossibility of natural processes. In this passage, a confrontation between Virgil and Dante is already evident. If he had been able to believe before what he had never seen save in my verses, Dante is, in a sense, testing the truth of what he read in his guide's text. He has encountered the scene in the Aeneid, and now witnesses something entirely different. This emphasizes the act of reading itself. How do we read, and what do we accept as true? When one reads a story, there is a yielding to it, a desire for the story to reflect the self as much as the self seeks to understand the story. Dante suggests that one must go beyond the literal account, for Virgil's scene, though vivid, cannot fully capture reality. The reader must confront what is real. The tree responds to Virgil with a captatio benevolentia. You so allure me with your sweet words. This rhetorical gesture draws attention to the power of language, the skill of persuasion, and the effect of eloquence. The soul's reply signals that rhetoric and style are central to this encounter, and even the story of a suicide is bound up with the language through which it is told. The soul continues, You so allure me with your sweet words that I cannot keep silent, and may it not burden you that I am enticed to talk a little. I am he who held both the keys of Frederick's heart, and turned them, locking and unlocking, so softly that from his secrets I kept almost every one. Here the pun on Peter is evident. He is like a Saint Peter holding the keys to the kingdom, but applied to Frederick, the emperor. The figure of Frederick functions almost as a guard of the city, a focal point for all faith and loyalty. Pier del Vigna, the soul speaking, was the emperor's chancellor and founder of the first secular state university in Europe, in Naples, designed to train lawyers and diplomats for service to the state. This university was distinct from schools controlled by theologians or canon lawyers, representing a secular and rational order. Pier del Vigna was also a poet and compiled the Institutes of Justice for the Kingdom, all of which emphasized moderation, order, and natural law as the organizing principles of governance. Yet by taking his own life, an act in violation of the most basic principles of natural law, he demonstrates a failure to live in accordance with the laws he professed to uphold. As the emperor's secretary, Pier del Vigna held a position of immense responsibility and trust. The term secretary derives from the Latin for to secrete, reflecting his role in discerning and guarding the emperor's secrets, knowing what could be shared and what must remain hidden. In his life, he was a close and strict collaborator of Frederick, embodying prestige, responsibility, and loyalty, but his suicide reveals a profound contradiction between his public duties, his ethical ideals, and his private despair. Pier del Vigna describes his time in Frederick's service with a solemn sense of devotion. So faithful was I to the glorious office that for it I lost both sleep and life. Here, the notion of fidelity extends beyond mere service to the emperor. It is also a meditation on how readers approach texts, on the faithfulness with which one engages with what is read. The cause of Pier del Vigna's tragic downfall and suicide is compared to a harlot, the personification of envy, the sin that thinkers such as Aquinas regard as the most corrosive because it lacks any positive quality. Most sins contain some element of attraction. Gluttony arises from the appeal of pleasure, pride from a sense of personal excellence. Even the hubris of Lucifer reflects a desire for divinity. Envy, however, is purely negative. It thrives on the unhappiness of others without any constructive aspect. In the microcosm of the court, a political and idealized order, this sin manifests as a destructive envy, the harlot that never turned her whorish eyes. Pier del Vigna recognizes the tragic nature of his own fate. My mind, in scornful temper, thinking by dying to escape from scorn, made me unjust against my just self. Through this repetition and doubling of language, he creates a closed circuit of self-reflection, a kind of self-babbling. The line raises an essential question. How many selves reside within Pier del Vigna? How many aspects of personality inhabit this one figure? The scene recalls Augustine's account in the first book of City of God, in which he recounts the fall of the Roman monarchy and the story of Lucretia. Lucretia commits suicide following the guilt and shame inflicted by her violation at the hands of Brutus. Augustine questions how she dares to take her own life, emphasizing that her act reflects a false transcendence. She refuses to coincide fully with her own identity and attempts to punish herself for perceived wrongs. Similarly, Pier del Vigna's suicide represents a sin of false transcendence, in which one assumes the power of God over oneself and enacts punishment against the self. Dante mirrors this doubleness in the style and structure of his text. Through Pier del Vigna, Dante dramatizes the tragic phenomenology of suicide. By the new roots of this tree I swear to you that I never broke faith with my Lord, who was so worthy of honor. And if one of you returns to the world, Let him comfort my memory, which still lies prostrate from the blow that envy gave it. Here Dante provides a theological account of suicide from an Augustinian perspective. Lucretia, for instance, resides in limbo, while Cato, another renowned suicide, appears in the first canto of Purgatory. Dante's depiction demonstrates his awareness of the varied nature of these acts and his refusal to reduce them to a single, universal explanation. In Canto 15, Dante encounters another significant figure from the world of education, his teacher Brunetto Latini. Latini was a translator into the vernacular, who adapted and commented on Cicero's rhetorical works, and a respected teacher among the Florentines. He embodies the values of the Ciceronian humanistic and rhetorical tradition. At one point, he was sent on an embassy to France, and during his absence, he and his political party were banned from Florence. He eventually returned, and Dante regards him as a model, particularly in the early stages of his political thought, though later intellectual encounters with theologians and philosophers would alter Dante's perspectives. In the text, Dante places Brunetto Latini in the area of violence, specifically violence against nature, as he is condemned for the sin of sodomy. There is no historical evidence that he committed such an act, and Dante's understanding of sodomy, particularly in Purgatory, offers a more nuanced interpretation. Nevertheless, his placement in this region reflects the poetic and moral landscape Dante constructs rather than historical fact. The canto emphasizes the natural world and its chaotic, violent forces. Dante describes the scene. Now one of the hard margins bears us on, and the vapor from the stream overshades, so that it shelters the water and the banks from fire. The natural environment is compared to the Netherlands, where the land lies below the level of water and requires dikes to protect it, and to the Brenta in Padua, where embankments shield towns and castles from the river's heat. Yet even these defences are imperfect. The banks are neither high nor thick enough to control the overwhelming force of nature. Dante then provides the background for the encounter with his teacher. We were already so far removed from the wood that I should not have seen where it was, had I turned to look back, when we met a troop of souls that were coming alongside the bank, and each looked at us as men look at one another under a new moon at dusk. A strange nocturnal atmosphere is created, intensified by the description, and they knit their brows at us as the old tailor does at the eye of his needle. This image of a tailor, attentive to detail and measurement, reflects Dante's sensitivity to the human and familiar even as he approaches the sublime, a motif he will later evoke in his vision of paradise. Recognition is central to this scene, Dante continues. Thus by that company, I was recognized by one who took me by the hem and cried, "What a marvel!" And I, when he reached out his arm to me, fixed my eyes on his scorched face, so that the baked features did not prevent my knowing him, and reaching down my hand toward his face, I answered, "Are you here, Ser Brunetto?" In Inferno, encounters of recognition are frequent, emphasizing not just physical identification, but also understanding and acknowledgement of those one believed one knew. This broader sense of recognition, seeing and comprehending another in the fullness of their identity, is a central theme in Dante's depiction of the damned and their relationships. Brunetto replies, "O my son, let it not displease you if Brunetto Latini turns back a little with you, and lets the train go on." Twice in the conversation, Brunetto calls Dante my son, establishing a familiarity that goes beyond ordinary discipleship. Dante resists the affectionate overture, yet he consistently regards Brunetto as a father figure. He answers respectfully, "I beg it of you with all my heart, and if you wish me to sit with you, I will, if it please him there with whom I go." Dante is referring to Virgil, though he leaves the name unspoken, subtly signaling the shifted loyalty from one teacher to another. In any case, the two agree to converse. The spatial arrangement of the encounter is significant. The disciple stands above, the teacher below, requiring Dante to bow slightly to speak, a gesture of reverence for his master's authority. At the same time, it suggests that their hierarchy now operates in both directions. The relationship has changed since their days in the streets of Florence. Brunetto's first question is revealing. What chance or destiny brings you down here before your last day, and who is this that shows the way? he struggles to grasp the trajectory of Dante's journey. This initiates a series of misunderstandings between teacher and disciple, as two different value systems collide. Brunetto speaks as a true humanist, grounded in Ciceronian ethics, seeing the world as governed by chance encounters and overarching destinies, yet devoid of Christian providence. Dante responds with a succinct account of his recent experience. There above, in the bright life, I went astray in a valley, before my age was at the full. Only yesterday morning I turned my back on it. He appeared to me, as I was returning into it, and by this path he leads me home. These words highlight a fundamental difference between them. For Brunetto, home is Florence, understood politically. For Dante, home is the soul, the place where the spirit is fully expanded. One frames existence in civic terms, the other in theological terms, and the two perspectives clash. Brunetto then offers astrological guidance, reinforcing his emphasis on chance and destiny. If you follow your star, you cannot fail of a glorious port. Dante dramatizes the ambiguity of such words. What is glorious to a humanist differs from its meaning to a theologically oriented thinker. In theology, glory relates to nature, grace, and the divine. For Brunetto, it signifies fame and worldly success. He mistakenly assumes that Dante's spiritual struggle mirrors his own political losses, believing that the pilgrim's experience is a direct reflection of his own exile and the loss of Florence. Brunetto prophesies Dante's exile. Old report in the world calls them blind. It is a people avaricious, envious, and proud. Your fortune holds for you such honor that the one party and the other shall be ravenous against you. In other words, both the Guelphs and the Ghibellines will turn against him. Dante responds, If my prayer were all fulfilled, you would not yet be banished from human nature, for in my memory is fixed, and now saddens my heart, the dear, kind, paternal image of you, when in the world hour by hour you taught me how man makes himself eternal, and how much I hold it in gratitude it behooves me, while I live, to declare it in my speech. That which you tell me of my course I write, and keep with a text to be glossed by a lady who will know how, if I reach her. Here Dante alludes to Beatrice, though it will not be she who later prophesies his exile. Rather, it will be Dante's grandfather, Cacciaguida, in the symmetrically connected cantos 15 and 16 of Paradiso. The contrast between this self-claimed spiritual father, Brunetto, and the heroic grandfather, Cacciaguida, establishes a clear antithesis. While Dante acknowledges Brunetto's teaching, he also creates some critical distance. True immortality, Dante implies, is not man-made. A person may achieve provisional forms of immortality through children, wealth, or monuments, but only the salvation of the soul grants eternal life. This scene, therefore, emphasizes the difference between these two men, and misunderstandings define their encounter. Brunetto's sodomy also requires understanding. It is linked to violence, since this is the realm of violence, and Dante seeks to know who the other sinners are. Brunetto explains that they are all clerks and famous scholars, mentioning them specifically. Priscian, a renowned grammarian, and Francesco Diacorso, such scurf. Then he abruptly concludes, I would say more, but my going and my speech must not be longer, for I see yonder a new smoke rising from the sand. People are coming with whom I must not be. Let my treasure, in which I yet live, be commended to you, and I ask no more. Like a true teacher, he leaves a bibliography. Dante should read his book, specifically his Tresor, in which I yet live. Finally, Brunetto departs. He turned back, and seemed like one of those who run for the green cloth in the field at Verona, and of them seemed he who wins, not he who loses. The image is playful. He appears to lead the race, yet in truth he is behind by a lap. This image closes the encounter, leaving a subtle sense of irony and perspective on Brunetto's role as precursor and teacher. Brunetto recommends his Treasure, a French text he wrote. It is one of the most important encyclopedias in the vernacular, yet it falls short compared to the poetic encyclopedia Dante is producing. Dante is in the midst of a learning process, so his text functions as an encyclopedia with a path toward learning, unlike Brunetto's more abstract compilation. Moreover, Brunetto wrote in French. Dante, in one of his philosophical reflections, notes that humans are naturally attached to their own language. Because of this, some have interpreted Brunetto's presence in this part of hell as a violation of the natural affection humans feel for their mother tongue. Regardless, the bibliography dramatizes a profound self-delusion. Though dead and circling under the rain of fire, Brunetto still believes he lives within his text. He confuses the symbolic life of the text with reality. The imagery and seeming of this canto must be understood through this error. A greater mistake Brunetto makes is assuming Dante's life mirrors his own. He believes Dante needs only to read his text, as if everything Dante must know is already contained there. He refuses to acknowledge that Dante's life has its own development and destiny, one that Brunetto cannot grasp. Canto 15 ends with a suggestion that the sin of sodomy can be understood as a confusion between reality and imagination, a merging of the real world with fiction. Moving into Canto 16, Dante approaches the end of the intermediate region, the realm of violence. Some may be surprised that these sins occupy the middle of hell's structure. In modern thought, violence often seems the worst possible crime, yet for Dante, the most terrible sins are those of fraud. He is about to encounter a monstrous figure who will allow him access to the lower depths, the realm of fraud. This is the figure of Gerion, first seen at the end of Canto 16. Dante climbs onto Gerion, with Virgil behind him, and they descend, an experience of wonder and infernal sublimity. Dante writes, "To that truth which has the face of a lie a man should always close his lips so far as he can, fraud being a mixture of truth and deception, much like the effect of literature itself." He continues, "For through no fault of his it brings reproach, but here I cannot be silent. And reader, I swear to you by the strains of this comedy, that I saw, through that thick and murky air, come swimming upwards a figure amazing to every steadfast heart, even as he returns who sometimes goes down to loose the anchor caught on a reef or something hidden in the sea, who stretches upward his arms and draws in his feet." This marks the second direct address to the reader, the first appearing in Canto 9, demonstrating Dante's strategy of establishing authority and trust in his account of Gerion's approach. In this passage, several metaphors are significant. First, the journey with Gerion is both aerial and aquatic. Although Gerion flaps his wings through the murky air, Dante describes the movement as if it were a journey by sea, using the metaphor of swimming. "I saw, through that thick and murky air, come swimming upwards a figure." For Dante, the mode of travel is unimportant. All journeys lead to the same destination, ultimately to the absolute. Gerion functions as a ministerial figure, carrying Dante and his guide, yet Dante also recognizes that a larger, absolute plan must still unfold before him. The second metaphor comes from Gerion's rotatory movement through the air, reflecting Dante's consistent use of circles and spirals to signify motion in Inferno. Finally, Dante swears by his own text, elevating it to the status of a sacred object. This marks a symbolic replacement. The violation of the Aeneid that began this section of hell gives way to the comedy as the new guiding text. Just as Dante leaps onto Gerion's back in Canto 16, readers, too, must make metaphorical leaps to follow him deeper into hell. Canto 17 is extraordinary because it is the only time Virgil leaves Dante alone. Dante must confront the usurers without guidance, discovering through his own effort the nature of their temptations and the consequences of usury. There is a biographical resonance here. The poet edges toward the condition of the usurer, and his own father was involved in similar financial activities. By Canto 19, Dante's voice shifts radically. He adopts what can be called a prophetic tone, assuming a public, authoritative role that contrasts sharply with the political rhetoric used in the encounter with Brunetto. For Dante, the prophetic voice does not foretell the future. Instead, it reads the present in light of what God's promises have been, particularly as revealed to Israel. Prophets serve as commentators, bringing ancient memory and divine perspective to interpret unfolding events. This is the framework through which Dante understands the exercise of prophecy, reading the present through memory, history, and moral discernment. Another important background detail concerns Dante as a prolific letter writer. He composed many epistles, though most of the letters he wrote on behalf of his patrons are lost. What survives are the letters he wrote in his own name. Among the most notable is one addressed to the Italian cardinals who were in conclave, confined to a place where they were to elect a pope but could not reach an agreement. Dante begins by acknowledging that they might wonder who he is, and what authority allows him to speak to them or to urge action. He anticipates the objection that a layman should not intervene in sacred matters. He even alludes to the biblical prophet who tried to steady the Ark of the Covenant as it was being carried into Jerusalem and was struck down by God for his audacity. These references signal Dante's awareness of the risks involved in taking on a prophetic voice. This caution is especially relevant in his confrontation with the Simonists in Canto 19. The Simonists are followers of Simon, known as a magician in the Acts of the Apostles. Simon tried to buy the power of prophecy and miracle working from Peter, challenging him in a contest of flight from a tower, only to fall and perish. Dante uses this story as an allegory to criticize the popes of his time, Nicholas III, Boniface VIII, and Clement V, all of whom engaged in simony, buying and selling sacred privileges. Simon's act becomes a model for the sacrilege Dante observes. Commerce in sacred matters is equivalent to blasphemy. This raises a persistent question in Dante's thought. What is sacred, and how do we recognize it? What does it mean to violate it? The sacred is continually tested, as the prophetic mode comes dangerously close to profanation. There is an added layer of subtlety. Peter's other name is Simon, so the first pope is also Simon Peter. This creates a metonymic closeness between the prophetic voice and its possible abuse. Dante's exploration of the sacred constantly navigates this precarious boundary. In addressing the Simonists, he straddles this line, testing the limits of the prophetic in the pursuit of moral and theological truth. In this canto, Dante dramatizes the concerns about prophecy, sacred violation, and moral corruption. He begins with an apostrophe, "O Simon Magus," immediately addressing the figure of sin, followed by another address, "O you his wretched followers who, rapacious, prostitute for gold and silver the things of God which ought to be the brides of righteousness." This defines simony as spiritual adultery, a corruption of the sacred union between God and the soul. In the book of Revelation, heavenly Jerusalem is described as the wife of God, while the whore of Babylon represents the end-time political power with whom the followers of Satan will commit spiritual fornication. Throughout the canto, apostrophes function both as invocations and as forms of lament. They express grief, a breaking of silence in response to the enormity of sin, and a refusal to acquiesce. The language hovers between speech and silence, capturing the essence of the prophetic voice, which cannot remain quiet when confronted by evil. Dante then describes the infernal landscape. "Upon the sides and upon the bottom I saw the livid stone full of holes, all of one size, and each was round. They seemed to me not less wide or larger than those that are made for the baptizings in my beautiful San Giovanni." He refers to the baptismal fonts of Florence, usually octagonal, and recounts a figurative act in which he broke one to save a drowning person. This act, though seemingly a profanation, is justified as an intervention in sacred matters to preserve life, emphasizing the principle of righteous action over strict ritual. Next, Dante depicts the sinners in this region of hell. From the mouth of each projected the feet of a sinner and his legs as far as the calf, and the rest was within. The popes are placed upside down, echoing the fate of Simon Magus and recalling St. Peter's wish to be crucified upside down as a symbol of proper spiritual orientation. In this inverted world, head down means heading toward the true destination. The motif of inversion underscores the corruption of the sacred order and the punishment that mirrors the sin. These souls endure further torment through a perverse parody of Pentecost. Flames rain upon them and run along their feet. This is a distortion of the gift of tongues and prophecy. Where humans are naturally capable of communicating through charity or language, These sinners are deprived of all understanding. Their punishment represents both the perversion of divine gifts and the total loss of spiritual and linguistic connection. Dante asks Virgil to identify a particular sinner who writhes himself, twitching more than all his fellows, and who is sucked by a ruddier flame, introducing a series of inversions in the process. Dante describes himself as standing there like the friar, even though he is a layman, marking a reversal of roles. The Pope in question is revealed to be Nicholas III, who assumes the guise of an assassin. In this inverted world, identities and authority are misaligned. Nicholas III soon expresses a pointed misunderstanding, claiming that the reigning Pope, Boniface VIII of the Orsini family, has already arrived. He taunts Dante. "Are you already standing there, Bonifacio? By several years the writ has lied to me. Are you so quickly sated with those gains for which you did not fear to take by guile the beautiful lady, and then to do her outrage?" Dante's text thus allows him, as a prophetic voice, to accuse powerful figures of their abuses. Initially uncertain how to respond, Dante is urged by Virgil to correct the former pope's misconception. Nicholas III replies with pomp, "Then what is it you ask of me? If to know who I am concerns you so much that you have for that come down the bank, know that I was vested with the great mantle." Dante counters with a general prophetic critique. "Pray now tell me how much treasure did our Lord require of St. Peter before he put the keys into his keeping? Surely he asked nothing save, 'Follow me.' Nor did Peter or the others take gold or silver of Matthias when he was chosen for the office which the guilty soul had lost." Dante acts in this manner because he confronts a void of authority in Boniface, and he assumes the role necessary to restore what is missing. This confusion between secular and sacred authority traces back to the so-called donation of Constantine. This 4th century document claimed that Emperor Constantine had granted the lands of the Roman Empire to Pope Sylvester I, effectively giving the Pope secular power. Dante perceives this as a fundamental misalignment. The Pope should concern himself only with spiritual matters. The sin of simony is therefore intertwined with this historical claim. The problem is compounded by the fact that the donation of Constantine was a forgery. The truth would not be established until the 15th century, when Nicholas of Cusa emphasized the moral flaws in the donation, echoing Dante's concerns. Lorenzo Valla, a philologist, conclusively proved the document's falsity by analyzing its language, showing that its Latin reflected the 11th century rather than the 4th. Valla demonstrated with meticulous precision that the donation was forged in a convent in southern France. But these discoveries came long after Dante's time, so why does the donation matter so much to him? Dante treats it as a central concern because it embodies the confusion of the spiritual and the secular, which simony makes visible. Simony, in turn, crystallizes the critical crisis of his own era. He also wrote a political treatise called Monarchia, which argues for a clear separation between church and state. This separation was necessary both to protect the state from ecclesiastical intrusion and to safeguard the church from interference by secular powers. The argument moves in both directions and represents the most significant point of Canto 19. A different question of registers emerges in Canto 21, which deserves brief attention. Dante emphasizes the humble style of his comedy, as if to free himself from the burden of lofty language or from the extraordinary claim of speaking as a prophet of his age. This comedic style is also linked to a peculiar experience in the canto, the fear of falling. Demons pursue him, which he calls Ghibellines. These fiends act as enemies attempting to throw him down, and here the link between comedy and the fall becomes clear. Laughter, in a sense, begins at the moment when someone slips. The chase ends, and the fear of falling dissipates as Dante moves into Cantos 24 and 25, the realm of the thieves. He is overwhelmed by the metamorphoses he observes. The punishment of these thieves forces them to continually transform. Humans bitten by snakes become snakes, then ashes, and then recompose themselves, endlessly cycling. Dante describes it vividly. A small fiery serpent, black and livid, transfixed one of the thieves in the very part of the body through which we take nourishment, then fell down. The victim stared at it silently, as if in sleep or fever, while smoke rose from the wound and from the serpent's mouth, and the smoke mingled. After this account, Dante interrupts the chronicle of his witnessing to speak of other poets. He declares that Lucan should be silent regarding Sabellus and Nasidius, and Ovid should remain silent on Cadmus and Arethusa. In Ovid's Metamorphoses, one is transformed into a serpent, the other into a fountain, but Dante claims that he envies him not. For two natures front to front, he never so transmuted that both forms were prompt to exchange their substance. Dante asserts that his vision of metamorphosis surpasses what Ovid or Lucan created. Ovid's transformations are guided by a harmonious bond between humans and nature, serene and poetic. Lucan, in his account of the Roman civil wars, also treats metamorphosis in a particular historical and narrative way. Dante's metamorphoses, by contrast, are grotesque, violent, and morally charged, reflecting the suffering and corruption of the souls he encounters. Dante is reenacting the same kind of aesthetic temptation witnessed in Canto 4 of Inferno, in Limbo. There, he encountered the great poets, Homer, Virgil, Horace, Lucan, and Ovid, and was captivated by the possibility of sitting among them. Yet in this later scene, the harmony suggested in Canto 4 is completely overturned. Dante now positions himself as their rival, even superior, perceiving things they never imagined. Any previous illusion of idyllic fellowship among these poets is dispelled. Once again, Dante descends, performing an act of spiritual humility, yet his voice conveys the opposite, a sense of hubris. The structure mirrors that of Canto 4, repeating itself in form and tension. In parallel, Canto 4 presented Dante establishing fellowship with the great poets, only to confront his responsibilities as a writer in Canto 5 through his encounter with Francesca, a reader of his work. Similarly, as Dante leaves Canto 25 and enters Canto 26, he meets Ulysses, the master rhetorician, whose journey leads him and his companions to a tragic end. For Dante, this is extraordinary. Ulysses serves as a constant point of reference for his own adventure. Dante recalls him later in Canto 19 of Purgatorio and in Canto 28 of Paradiso, when approaching the edge of the physical universe. Looking back, Dante sees the path where Ulysses exceeded all boundaries. Ulysses becomes a mode of being, a possibility of being, for Dante himself. Every educated person in antiquity, and in Dante's own time, knew Ulysses as the famed Greek hero, polytropic, a man of many turns, seasoned by countless experiences. They knew he fought at Troy, proposed the Trojan horse, and stole the Palladium, a simulacrum of Minerva. They knew it took him 10 years to return to Ithaca, the story of the Odyssey, completing the Nostos, the journey home, and earning him the status of hero of nostalgia. In antiquity, the story of Ulysses had also become a philosophical allegory for the soul's fate. The journey from Ithaca to Troy, followed by 10 years of trials, symbolized the soul's incarnation, passage through the planets, and cleansing of their corrupting influences. Some souls are lunatic, others mercurial, others saturnine, but by purification, the soul returns to its origin. This was how the Alexandrian Neoplatonists read the Odyssey. A central theme of this canto is Dante's divergent interpretation of Ulysses and the Greek world. Dante immediately departs from the standard tale. In his hands, Ulysses has already returned to Ithaca and is ready to begin new voyages of exploration. The idea of closure, the final return home, does not exist in Dante's imagination. He is a restless poet, always sending himself and his heroes on quests, journeys toward places or ideas, much like philosophers striving for wisdom and truth. In Dante's comedy, Ulysses embarks once again, driven by a gratuitous quest for knowledge in unpeopled lands, and he dies as a result. That is the tragic endpoint of his renewed journey. The first thing to notice is that Dante does not conduct the conversation with Ulysses. It is Virgil, the poet of Latin antiquity, who takes on this role, and they speak Greek. Virgil positions himself as the proper interlocutor for the great Greek hero, while Dante remains an observer. This choice reflects a sense of stylistic decorum. Dante refrains from inserting himself directly, allowing the exchange between two classical figures to unfold. Moreover, this reinterpretation of Ulysses' story reaches the level of tragic sublime. Virgil, the author of tragedy rather than comedy, lends the episode a weighty grandeur, and Ulysses himself speaks in the loftiest terms, narrating his life almost as if he were Aeneas. Some readers of Virgil and Homer might suggest that the first half of the Aeneid parallels the Odyssey and the second half the Iliad, but Dante makes clear the distinction. Ulysses has a home to return to, completing the journey from Ithaca to Troy and back, whereas Aeneas walks an open-ended path, with no destination. In the Inferno, Ulysses embodies this same restless, boundless journey, presenting an ambiguous figure, a philosopher and rhetorician who manipulates all knowledge for his own ends. Dante emphasizes this ambiguity from the outset of Canto 26. The canto begins with a topical allusion to Florence, Dante's native city, as if he wishes to anchor the narrative in something concrete. It opens as an apostrophe, "Rejoice, O Florence, since you are so great." The rhetorical play on "great" and the contrast with the small or the humble recurs throughout the canto, prompting reflection on what constitutes true greatness. Ulysses views himself in lofty terms, while Dante simultaneously satirizes Florence. "Over land and sea you beat your wings, and your name is spread through hell." The city's so-called greatness is brought into question, particularly in light of the thieves Dante has observed. Dante also shifts verb tenses to create a dual perspective. I sorrowed then, and sorrow now again. The first sorrow belongs to the pilgrim, witnessing the events, while the second belongs to the writer, reflecting upon them. This dual focus continues. "When I turn my mind to what I saw, and I curb my genius more than I am wont, lest it run where virtue does not guide it." Dante attempts to restrain his imaginative powers as he recounts the story of Ulysses' unbounded hunger for knowledge, a flight of the mind likened to Icarus. Ulysses transgresses all limits, yet Dante implicitly suggests that he too risks overstepping boundaries. The language of running evokes the horses of the soul, with virtue represented as the ability to control both the black and white horses of the chariot, maintaining their harmony. This Neoplatonic imagery underscores Dante's reflection on discipline, reason, and the necessary guidance of virtue amid the soaring ambitions of the mind. Then comes the first description of the landscape, a dark and somber scene. As many as the fireflies which the peasant, resting on the hill, in the season when the one who lights the world least hides his face, and at the hour when the fly yields to the mosquito, sees along the valley, perhaps where he gathers grapes and tills the soil. With so many flames the eighth ditch was all agleam, as I perceived when I reached the point where the bottom could be seen. And as he who was avenged by the bears saw Elijah's chariot depart, when the horses rose erect to heaven, for he could not follow it with his eyes, seeing nothing but the flame alone, like a little cloud ascending, so each flame moves along the gullet of the ditch, for not one reveals its theft, and each carries away a sinner. Dante is not comparing himself to Elijah directly. Rather, he aligns himself with someone who watches Elijah. Elijah himself embodies a flight of the soul, like Ulysses, yet Dante positions himself as different from both, resembling instead Eliseus, the one who inherits the prophetic mantle and serves as witness. He seeks to avoid the extremes of the prophet and the rhetorician. Virgil explains that within the flames are spirits. In each forked flame there are two souls, Ulysses and Diomedes. Except in the case of suicides, Dante always places sinners in pairs. Diomedes remains silent, while Ulysses speaks, emphasizing the social dimension of moral wrongdoing. A moral violation almost always involves another person, either a witness or an accomplice, except in the case of suicide, where sinner, victim, and witness converge in one figure. The flame is described as so divided at its top that it seems to rise from the pyre where Eteocles was laid with his brother, establishing a connection to ancient Greece. The story, drawn from the Thebaid, presents the brothers Eteocles and Polynices, enemies from birth, as children of Oedipus and Jocasta, symbolizing the tragic city. For Dante, this Greek notion of cities and birth is deeply tragic, in contrast to Virgil's perspective, which celebrates birth. These flames are thus already infused with an aura of tragedy. Dante requests to speak with the fiery souls. "Master, I earnestly pray you, and pray again, that my prayer avail 1,000, that you deny me not to wait until the horned flame comes hither. You see how with desire I bend towards it." Virgil responds, "Your prayer deserves much praise, and therefore I accept it, but restrain your tongue." Previously, Virgil urged Dante to curb his imaginative powers. Now he asks him to curb his speech. "Leave speech to me, for I have understood what you wish, and perhaps, since they were Greeks, they would disdain your words." Here the hierarchy of styles begins to emerge. Virgil and Ulysses take precedence, and later, in Canto 27, it will be Guido de Montefeltro and Dante. Virgil asks to hear the story of one of the sinners, and Ulysses speaks with a tongue of flame, whipping in the wind. He begins, "I departed from Circe, who held me for more than a year near Gaeta, before Aeneas had so named it." Ulysses frames his story through the myth of Aeneas, asserting priority over Aeneas himself. Yet Ulysses lacks the human ties that Aeneas possesses. Aeneas found cities and names Gaeta after his nurse, while for Ulysses, neither fondness for my son, nor reverence for my aged father, nor the due love which would have made Penelope glad, could conquer in me the longing that I had to gain experience of the world, and of human vice and worth. The language is intensely ethical, signaling that his quest is driven by moral purpose, and nothing, neither love nor duty, can stand in the way of this pursuit. Ulysses sets sail aboard a single ship and recounts the cities he encounters, places in Spain, Morocco, Sardinia, and Ceuta, beyond the Mediterranean. He appears as a man untethered to any one place, always searching, never settled, a soul in constant motion. These wanderings continue until he and his companions reach the narrow strait marked by Hercules to warn men not to pass beyond. Here, Ulysses addresses his companions with rhetorical skill. He begins with an appeal to fraternity, calling them brothers, a masterful captatio benevolentia. He removes hierarchy and asserts solidarity. He then employs hyperbole, magnifying both their past achievements and the perils ahead. "O brothers, who through 100,000 dangers have reached the West, to this so brief vigil of our senses that remains to us, choose not to deny experience." The West is a vague but elevated destination, and the oscillation between grandeur and modesty, between hyperbole and restraint, underlies his rhetorical finesse. The repeated emphasis on experience links knowledge to journeying and movement. Wisdom is pursued through travel, and Ulysses' words act as a subtle lure, a rhetorical trap drawing his companions into the perilous quest. Ulysses then appeals to his companions' sense of dignity and purpose to secure their agreement. He urges them to consider their origin, insisting that to understand the end of things, one must first understand the beginning, the seed from which they spring. For Ulysses, being of noble origin instills a natural drive toward a noble outcome, and he extends this reasoning to his men. "You were not made to live as brutes, but to pursue virtue and knowledge." The line is striking, in a possible reference to Circe, who had transformed these companions into the swine of Epicurus. Indulging in sensual pleasures, Ulysses promises not only to restore their human dignity, but also to guide them toward virtue and knowledge. Yet this promise is deeply problematic. He equates virtue with knowledge, but knowing what is virtuous does not guarantee that one possesses it. One may understand prudence without being prudent. With these false assurances, Ulysses lures his men to their destruction. His sin, then, lies in counseling his companions to exceed the bounds of human knowledge. For Dante, the figure of the counselor is endlessly fascinating. Earlier examples include Pier del Vigna, who faced the pressures of court and advised Emperor Frederick, and later figures, such as a provençal poet in Inferno, who incited war between father and son, fracturing the unity of the state. Ulysses is the counselor who offers grand but ultimately misleading advice. Dante positions Ulysses and his men at the edge of the Pillars of Hercules, implying that the pursuit of true knowledge requires some measure of transgression. To discover what no one has yet known, Ulysses must surpass the known world. In this sense, he anticipates the spirit of the Renaissance. Dante himself is not disturbed by such transgression, as he frequently exceeds limits of his own, beyond the sun, farther than Daedalus, certainly beyond Icarus. Yet the promise Ulysses makes to his companions remains flawed. Dante famously characterizes it as a mad flight, a venture propelled by ambition and curiosity but doomed by its very overreach. Dante emphasizes Ulysses' madness by highlighting the political consequences of the promises he makes. Canto 26 is filled with references to fallen cities. It opens with Florence, which Dante apostrophizes, imagining the city spreading its wings as if it were a hero in flight. This signals Dante's intent for readers to connect Ulysses' moral decline and corruption with the fate of his native city. Beyond Florence, there are references to Troy, Thebes through Eteocles and Polynices, and Rome. The canto, in miniature, functions as an epic. The epic impulse is always political, concerned with the rise and fall of cities and their role in larger metaphysical or historical dramas, whether it be heavenly Jerusalem, Rome, Carthage, or Thebes. Dante's strategy is to show how Ulysses' lofty philosophical rhetoric collapses when measured against tangible consequences. Ulysses himself is placed nowhere, drifting in the ocean without a fixed destination. He moves from city to city, yet fails to fulfill the promises he has made. This underscores one tragic aspect of his story, the tragedy of language itself. Language can create mirages of greatness and action, but it often falls short of reality. Ulysses' journey is gratuitous, unanchored by responsibility or place, and it is this very emptiness that consigns him to hell among the evil counselors. He led his men to nothing after promising them everything, yet Ulysses continues to appear throughout the comedy, playing a paradigmatic role in Dante's imagination. His presence recurs as a haunting figure, in Canto 19 of Purgatorio, in Dante's reflections on the imaginative distances he has travelled, and at the boundary of the physical and metaphysical worlds in Paradiso. Dante looks back and sees Ulysses, or the site of his transgression. The figure of Ulysses lingers, shaping both Dante's imaginative vision and the structure of the Divine Comedy itself. Canto 27 should be read alongside Canto 26, as it functions like a countermyth to the story of Ulysses. There is a contraction of focus and a revision of the epic grandeur seen in the previous canto. Dante encounters Guido de Montefeltro, an extraordinary figure who was both a military and political leader and later became a Franciscan friar. Pope Boniface VIII, whose reputation Dante did not esteem highly, summons Guido for advice. The Pope's request, like that of Ulysses' companions, is morally compromised. He seeks guidance on strategies to conquer and destroy Palestrina, a small town near Rome. Here again, Dante examines the theme of malevolent counselors. The dialogue with Guido introduces a Machiavellian world of strategy, language, and cunning. Guido remarks that his methods were not those of a lion but of a fox, an image later echoed in Machiavelli's The Prince, where the perfect ruler must know when to exercise force and when to use cunning. These symbols originally derive from Cicero, and Dante incorporates them into his narrative, anticipating Machiavelli's later use. Canto 27 also mirrors Canto 26 through its depiction of destructive instruments and traps. The canto opens with a reference to the Sicilian bull, contrasting with the Trojan horse of the previous canto. As the Sicilian bull, which bellowed first with the cry of him who had shaped it with his file, was wont to bellow with the voice of the victim, so that, though it was of brass, it seemed transfixed with pain. The story signals a vulgar, demotic version of Ulysses' punishment. He is condemned by his own rhetorical skill, trapped by the flames he once wielded to persuade others. This is the story of the artist caught in the consequences of his own creation, like Daedalus, who becomes ensnared by the labyrinth he designed. By beginning with the Sicilian bull, Dante reflects on the preceding canto and understands the peril of pride, persuasion, and intellectual ambition. Suddenly, after this description, Virgil and Dante are interrupted by a voice requesting to speak with the one using the Lombard dialect, namely Dante. This is a striking reversal of the previous canto, where Virgil insisted that Dante should remain silent because the others were Greeks and Virgil alone should speak. Here, from Guido de Montefeltro's perspective, they are no longer speaking Homeric or Attic Greek, but an Italian dialect. This shift shows that language is not only about style, it always reflects an inner essence, revealing one's place on the ladder of values, the distance from truth, or the closeness to self-complacency, as with Ulysses. The soul asks, "If you have just fallen into this blind world from that sweet land of Italy from which I bring all my guilt, tell me whether the Romagnols live in peace or war, for I was of the mountains between Urbino and the chain from which the Tiber springs." Unlike Ulysses' lofty rhetoric, which deals with the grandest generalities of human fate, this language contracts in scope, focusing on the local realities of neighboring towns. Virgil now instructs Dante to converse with Guido, as he is Italian. On the surface, rhetorical decorum and the hierarchy of styles are still observed. Dante informs Guido of the situation in Italy, and Guido responds, "If I thought my answer were to one who might ever return to the world, this flame would tremble no more. But since from this depth none ever returned alive, if what I hear is true, I answer you without fear of infamy." His speech is notable for its style. Curses, hypotheticals, parenthetical remarks, deliberately contrasting with Ulysses' smooth, elevated style. Guido recounts, "I was a man of arms, and then accorded friar, trusting, so girt, to make amends, and certainly my hope would have come full, but for the high priest, may ill befall him, who set me back in my first sins, and how and wherefore I would have you hear from me." He begins his story with birth, the first major event of his life, and moves through subsequent actions, tracing how his life diverged from the promise that birth seemed to hold. Guido emphasizes that his deeds were not those of the lion, but of the fox, evoking the Machiavellian language of strategic cunning. Dante here enters the secret halls of power, where plans for the destruction of cities are devised, and the Pope seeks clandestine counsel from his strategist, who knew all wiles and covert ways, and plied the art of them. This recalls Canto 26, which opens with Florentine thieves and the language of concealment, echoing the canto of the thieves. The connection suggests a link between thievery and speech. Ulysses, the master rhetorician, is possessed by language, while more generally the language of theft conveys the furtiveness inherent in human communication. In Canto 26, the sun is described indirectly, hidden from the sinner's view, emphasizing how language conceals as much as it reveals. Across these cantos, language functions as a tool of manipulation, political strategy, and subtle artifice, and in Canto 26 this function is made particularly visible. Guido's account of his life continues, "When I reached that stage when every man should lower the sails, as if he were a mariner like Ulysses, and coil up the ropes, that which had once pleased me now grieved me, and with repentance and confession I became a friar, and woe is me, it would have availed. The prince of the new Pharisees, having war near the Lateran, and not with Saracens or Jews, for all his enemies were Christian, and none had gone to conquer Acre or traded in the lands of the Soldan, regarded neither the supreme office nor holy orders in himself, nor the cord that once made its wearers leaner." Here, Dante places us within the corridors of what we would now call the Vatican, then known as the Church of St. John the Lateran, residence of the Bishop of Rome, famous for frescoes depicting Constantine's donation to Pope Sylvester. The question of the temporal power of the papacy is emphasized throughout this encounter between Guido and Boniface. Boniface seeks Guido's counsel in a grotesque inversion of the Holy Office, offering absolution before the crime is even committed. "Let not your heart mistrust. I absolve you here and now, and do you teach me how I may cast Penestrino to the ground? I can lock and unlock heaven, as you know, for the keys are two, which my predecessor did not hold dear." This recalls Celestine V, who relinquished the papacy, embodying the tension between power and holiness, unable to reconcile the two forces, and retreating to a contemplative life. Dante treats him with mild severity for lacking the courage to resist corruption. Guido, too, succumbs to the pressures of corruption. He continues, "Thereon the weighty arguments pushed me to where silence seemed worst, and I said, 'Father, since you do wash me of that sin into which I now must fall, long promise with short keeping will make you triumph on the high seat.'" The promise of absolution makes Guido feel free to act, and even to take pleasure in the evil he is about to commit. The advice he gives is stark: make promises and do not keep them. Tell the people of Penestrino that you will respect them, enrich them, whatever is needed to gain access to the city, and then, when the gates open, break all those promises. This episode echoes a medieval understanding of rhetoric, often attributed to Cicero, which taught that rhetoric was the art of persuading citizens to maintain the city. Principle: promises were to be honored to ensure proper governance. Dante demonstrates how these principles can be perverted in practice, turning moral tools into instruments of deception. Finally, Dante tells what became of Guido at the end of his life. Saint Francis came to claim his soul, and a struggle ensued between Francis and the devil, with Francis ultimately losing. Guido is thus placed in hell. Dante includes these details because he later returns to this theme in Purgatorio, where he meets Guido's son. In this poetic universe, fathers and sons do not automatically share the same moral space, and sons are not bound to repeat the deeds of their fathers. This scene prefigures such later encounters, echoing the consequences of counsel, sin, and moral choice across generations. Before reaching Purgatory, the journey passes through the most tragic section of the Divine Comedy, from Canto 28 to the end of Inferno. These cantos reveal Dante's conception of tragedy and how he envisions the tragic within his work. While the poem is called a comedy, Dante interrogates the role and place of the tragic within it. As the following cantos make clear, the tragic is never the final vision. For Dante, the essence of tragedy is linguistic. It arises from the inherent ambiguities of language, from the impossibility of fully decoding or deciphering one statement against another. Language and tragedy are particularly evident in Canto 28, where Dante encounters Bertrand de Born, a Provençal poet whom he greatly admired. In his treatise on language, De Vulgari Eloquentia, Dante singles out Bertrand as a master of the most difficult poetic genre, excelling in rhymed war poetry, a form both technically and aesthetically challenging. Yet, in Inferno, Dante places him among the so-called makers of discord, a striking moral and poetic inversion. The canto opens with a reflection on war and the limitations of language. Who could ever fully tell, even in unfettered words, though many times narrating, the blood and the wounds that I now saw? Surely every tongue would fail, because of our speech and memory, which have little capacity to comprehend so much. Were all the people assembled again who once bewailed their blood shed by the Trojans in the fateful land of Apulia, and those of the long war that made so vast a spoil of rings, together with those who felt the pain of blows in the struggle with Robert Guiscard, and others whose bones are still heaped at Ceperano, and there by Tagliacozzo where old Olado conquered without arms, and one should show his limb pierced, and another his cut off, it would still not equal the foul fashion of the ninth pouch. This passage exemplifies the poetic device known as the ineffability topos, where the poet acknowledges the difficulty, or even impossibility, of adequately representing a reality. Traditionally associated with the vision of God, the ineffability topos expresses the limits of language in grasping the sublime. Dante adapts it to the realm of evil, creating a hell that possesses its own sublime quality, a counterpart to the divine spectacles he will witness in paradise. Even in this infernal setting, language is inadequate to capture the full horror and complexity. The dismemberments of bodies in historical wars pale in comparison to the grotesque realities of the ninth pouch, highlighting the challenges of representing evil and setting the stage for the further complications and nuances that will unfold throughout the canto. Amidst this language of the ineffable, there is a small but significant detail, a reference to Livy, the Roman historian. His voice carries unquestioned authority. Livy cannot err. The accounts of Livy and his fellow historians are considered accurate records of what they witnessed. Yet, Dante emphasizes that the poet's voice is not the same as the historian's. This tension between historical certainty and poetic representation is evident from the opening lines of the canto. The reflection then shifts to a different poetic register in the encounter with Bertrand de Born. Dante observes, "I stayed to view the troop, and saw a thing that I should be afraid even to relate without more proof." Here, the ineffable asserts itself again. The poet feels the difficulty of conveying the extraordinary and shocking reality before him. He continues, "Conscience, the good companion that emboldens a man under the hauberk of feeling itself pure, reassures me. Truly I saw, and seem to see it still, a trunk without the head going along as were the others of that dismal herd, and it was holding the severed head by the hair, swinging it in hand like a lantern, and it was gazing at us and saying, 'Oh me!' Of itself it was making a lamp for itself, and they were two in one and one in two." Dante employs a mathematical logic to describe Bertrand's divided body, a punishment in which the head is separated from the trunk yet held as if still a single entity. Two is one, and one is two. This numerical metaphor emphasizes the impossibility of equivalence and reflects the earlier depiction of battlefields, where countless limbs are piled together. Dante openly admits he cannot resolve this disparity. Only God can. Bertrand finally speaks, "See now my grievous penalty, you who, breathing, go to view the dead. See if any other is so great as this." He is the first in hell to protest that his punishment is excessive, that there is no proportionality between the crime he committed and the suffering he endures. He explains, "And that you may carry news of me, know that I am Bertrand de Born, he who to the young king gave the evil counsels. I made the father and the son rebel against each other. Ahithophel did not more with Absalom and David by his wicked instigations. Because I parted persons thus united, I carry my brain parted from its source, alas, which is in this trunk. Thus is the retribution observed in me." Bertrand's visible division reflects the principle that punishment in hell prolongs the choice made in life. He created division among others, so he himself is divided. This justice, called contrapasso, operates as a counterpart or counter-suffering. The punishment corresponds to the sin. It is not merely revenge in the form of an eye for an eye, but a moral and poetic logic in which the nature of the crime determines the form of its eternal recompense. The central point of this canto is that Bertrand de Born divides father and son, thereby violating a fundamental principle of political theology. A notable medieval historian, Ernst Kantorowicz, explored this in The King's Two Bodies, asking what a king truly is. According to Kantorowicz, a king possesses two bodies, a visible, mortal body and a mystical body of royalty. In the Middle Ages, they would say, "The king is dead, long live the king," emphasizing that the office endures even when the individual dies. By separating father and son, Bertrand de Born breaches the unity of this mystical royal body, for the two, the father and the son, are, in essence, one. This metaphor is also connected to the broader idea of the body politic, which had already appeared in the canto of Chaco. The city is imagined as a living body, with all its parts, patricians and plebeians alike, forming an organic and unified whole. This principle applies to the state, from a Roman perspective, and also to the mystical body of the Church. St. Paul, in his letter to the Ephesians, refers to the Church as the mystical body of Christ, and the state becomes a secular extension of this spiritual unity. Each member is part of the whole, like thumbs, toes, or hair, contributing to the integrity of the body. In Canto 28, there is a political focus on Rome, and also a reference to Muhammad. While many find it shocking that Muhammad is placed in this part of hell, the interpretation rests on his role as someone who caused division within the Church, creating a schism rather than committing heresy. Heretics deny core tenets of doctrine. Schismatics actively divide the body. Thus, whether in the Church or the state, division is the organizing theme of Canto 28. Dante's understanding of justice is deeply informed by philosophical and theological sources. He draws on the commentary on Aristotle's Ethics by Thomas Aquinas, reflecting on their shared discussion of justice. Dante is a poet of justice in a profound sense. His quest seeks to establish justice within the soul, to explore justice in the city, and to probe the possibility of universal justice. This stands in contrast to Lucretian ideas of cosmic chaos and anarchy, allowing for continuity between the inner and outer worlds. It is in this framework that Aristotle's and Aquinas' reflections on justice become relevant to Dante's moral and poetic vision. Their understanding of justice usually involves two types: retributive justice, which governs hell, and distributive justice. Dante is certainly aware of both. The representation of the Wheel of Fortune in Inferno 7 can be read as an example of distributive justice, which follows an arithmetic model. If one person has 5 of something and another has none, justice requires redistributing so that a measure of equality is achieved. Equality is always the goal of distributive justice. Retributive justice, however, operates differently. Aquinas, though Aristotle does not dwell on this, reflects on the difficulty of establishing exact correspondence between crime and punishment. If someone plucks out an eye and the victim does the same in return, the original state is not restored. How then can retributive justice be truly applied? Aristotle and Aquinas both suggest that exact reparation is rarely possible. If a clown were to strike the king striking the clown in return would not fully repair the violation, because the dignity of the office itself has been injured. Money and other forms of recompense are invented to address this gap. Dante reinterprets these ideas by exploring the problem of justice through the figure of Bertrand de Born. The poet demonstrates that language itself cannot always produce the right metaphor or the precise correspondence between reality and its representation. Dante signals that the connection between punishment and crime in hell is necessarily imperfect. The system is arbitrary to some degree. This point is reinforced at the start of Canto 29, which functions as a retrospective reflection on Canto 28. Dante is about to enter the circle of the falsifiers, those engaged in unnatural impersonations and transformations, but the punishments he has just described in the previous canto continue to occupy his attention. He cannot stop returning to what he has seen. The countless figures and strange wounds overwhelm him, and he feels drawn to linger and weep. Virgil interrupts, asking why his gaze remains fixed on the dismembered shades. He reminds Dante that the valley extends 22 miles in circumference, and that the moon is already beneath their feet. Time is short, and more remains to be seen beyond what is before them. The use of measurement here is notable. One famous reader of Inferno, Galileo, treated this detail arithmetically and calculated that hell might be roughly the size of Florence, demonstrating how even poetic numbers can spark reflection on scale and precision, whether as serious speculation or playful interpretation. The real reason for Dante's repeated backward glances becomes clear later. He observes, "Within that hollow where I was, but now holding my eyes so fixedly, I believe a spirit of my own blood laments the guilt that cost so dear down there. A relative of his resides in this part of hell." Virgil urges him to move on, explaining that the soul pointed at you and fiercely threatened with his finger, and I heard them call him Jerry del Bello, but Dante is too distracted to see him. He reflects, "The violent death which is not yet avenged for him by any who is partner in the shame made him indignant. Wherefore, as I judge, he went on without speaking to me, and thereby has he made me pity him the more." It is evident, Dante encounters a kinsman whose murder remains unavenged, and it will remain so. He is overwhelmed by pity and compassion, yet he does not pledge to avenge Jerry del Bello. Here, Dante is redefining the idea of justice as merely a doubling of the crime. The traditional notion of justice as revenge or precise equivalence is entirely abandoned. This marks the beginning of Dante's meditation on the nature of God's justice and his own authority in describing these matters. A tone of uncertainty and doubt enters the narrative. At the same time, Dante can assume a prophetic voice, presenting himself as one singularly chosen by divine grace to explore the world beyond, capturing its truths in the most physical and direct way. These two voices coexist, the prophet and the poet aware of the arbitrariness of his own constructions. Dante is simultaneously poet-theologian and poet-allegorist. This duality transforms the poem into an actual pilgrimage. The judgment the reader brings to the realities Dante presents becomes a reflection of the self, who one is and where one stands. The journey shifts from being guided solely by a master's voice to an interpretative exploration, in which the reader deciphers the text and participates actively in the story. Dante's journey becomes potentially the reader's journey as well. By questioning his own conception of justice, Dante invites the reader to confront it alongside him, making them his equal. Justice, indeed. As Inferno concludes, attention turns to Dante's tragic mode at the lowest depths of hell. Representing the tragic in a work called a comedy is a difficult endeavor, but this challenge is eased somewhat because the tragic here is not final, not a culminating vision, but part of a broader discourse that ultimately unfolds comically. Dante's vision, even of divinity and the cosmos, carries a sense of redemption, happiness, and harmony. A further difficulty lies in the Christian framework that shapes Dante's poem, where the tragic is hard to locate. There is, strictly speaking, no Christian tragedy. Yet this question is nuanced. Within the Christian perspective, the primary revelation of God's presence in history is the crucifixion. The narrative of a dying God, the suffering of divinity itself, is central, but even this is not a final vision. Dante must therefore confront both theological and aesthetic challenges. The resolution to the problem of tragedy rests in language and Dante's understanding of what the tragic entails. To appreciate this, it helps to look briefly beyond the text. Dante goes into exile in the year 1302, at which point he has written only one book, the Vita Nuova. This lyrical, self-contained work treats the self as absolute and love as absolute, allowing no intrusion into its orbit. He concludes the Vita Nuova with a vision, realizing that further efforts are required for his literary development. During this period, Dante writes little poetry, though he remains involved in political life, following the example of his teacher Brunetto Latini, and hoping for a life different from Latini's. Ironically, Dante's life proves more tragic. Whereas Latini experienced exile but returned to Florence, continued teaching, and wrote encyclopedic works like the Tresor, Dante's exile is permanent, and his trajectory even more fraught. In exile, the first work Dante composes is a Latin treatise on language, De Vulgari Eloquentia. Like the Divine Comedy, it reflects the perspective of exile, for Dante will never return to Florence. The reasons for writing this treatise remain partly obscure, as it was never finished. 2 books survive, though it is unknown how many Dante originally planned. The treatise begins in the manner of medieval scholarly texts, addressing metaphysical questions. What does human language do? Is language human? Dante concludes that it is both human and not human. It is human because humans alone speak, though he allows for miraculous exceptions in which certain animals speak intelligibly, as in biblical accounts. Angels, however, do not speak in human language, communicating instead intuitively with one another and with God. Thus, ordinary human language exists, yet it is not entirely human. It is a divine gift. This forms the metaphysical premise of Dante's treatise, and underlies the way he approaches the tragic in the Divine Comedy. The first people to speak, according to Dante, were Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. The first language they spoke, he claims, was Hebrew. Dante presents Hebrew as the primal language, one that survived the fall of humankind and the building of the Tower of Babel. In his view, this language never truly disappeared. He treats Hebrew almost as if it exists outside the flow of history, unaffected by the changes to which all sublunary things are subject. This notion will later shift in Paradiso, when Dante meets Adam and presents a historicized perspective. Adam explains that the Hebrew language he once spoke vanished entirely after he ate the forbidden fruit. In other words, in the later work, Dante situates language within history, unlike the more ahistorical stance of the earlier treatise. In the second book of De Vulgari Eloquentia, Dante moves away from questions of grammar and the ordering of language, turning instead to rhetoric and the theory of poetry and style. He outlines three styles of poetry: high, middle, and low, or what can be understood as the styles of tragedy, elegy, and comedy. Dante emphasizes that style is not merely ornamentation, it is a mode of knowledge. The high style corresponds to elevated realities, the middle to the mixed world, and the low to the lives of those at the bottom of society. The fisherman or the clown cannot be addressed in the same decorum as the king, whose speech demands a sublime register. Style for Dante is intrinsically tied to the exchange of ideas and social position. He also develops a theory of the canzone, the greatest lyrical form, which brings out the inherent music of language. This theory responds to a poetic revolution in Sicily at the court of Frederick II, where poetry and music were separated, unlike the Provençal tradition in which poems were accompanied by the lute. The Sicilian approach allowed poetry to exist independently, emphasizing the intrinsic harmony of language itself. Dante reflects on poetic themes as well: the rectitude of the will, ethical order, love, and, as exemplified by Bertrand de Born, war. He concludes that poetry is the art that unites rhetoric and music, capturing both the ethical and aesthetic dimensions of language. This is the core of what survives of the vulgari eloquentia. Returning to the Divine Comedy, particularly the cantos of Lower Hell, it is clear that Dante consciously retrieves ideas from this treatise. There is a pattern of deliberate references, a retrospective view of past failures, and a consideration of tasks he once believed impossible. These connections between the treatise on the vulgar tongue and the cantos of Inferno gradually become more apparent, reinforcing the interplay between tragedy, language, and moral inquiry in his work. These cantos are set in the lower circles of hell, in the general realm of fraud. In Canto 11, where the ethical map of Inferno is outlined, Dante distinguishes between the sins of fraud and those of treachery. Treachery is a subset of fraud, because fraud can be committed by rhetoricians, falsifiers, flatterers, and others, but treachery is worse. Here, in this circle, are the treacherous sinners, those who violate the trust of those closest to them. Unlike ordinary fraud, which can be impersonal, treachery destroys bonds of love between friends, family, country, or hosts. Those who commit it annihilate all ties that form a community, severing the connection between self and others. Treachery, in this sense, is the language of nothing. It signifies that nothing matters, that there are no genuine attachments, and that the self exists in pure arbitrariness. Detached from relationships and exchanges, there is no language, no meaningful communication. Entering Canto 30, Dante explores two experiences that define the tragic mode. First, he refers to the time when Juno was enraged over Semele, mistress of Jupiter, drawing on the classical tragedy the Thebaid, where even the gods experience passions similar to human destructiveness. Immortal though she may be, Juno suffers the same forces of rage and jealousy that torment mortals like Semele. This is the language of the tragic, intertwined with mythopoeia and classical theology. Later, Dante recalls the story of the Trojans and the Ovidian tale of Myrrha, a young woman consumed by incestuous desire who disguises herself to sleep with her father. These stories establish the tragic perimeter of the cantos. The central tragic figure, however, is Sinon, the deceiver who persuaded the Trojans to bring the infamous horse within their walls. His name itself is a pun, yes-no, highlighting the falsification of identity. Sinon embodies the tragic contradiction of self, uncertain, deceptive, and capable of assuming the reality of another. This ambiguity of identity, suggested even by his name, links madness to the tragic in these cantos. Echoes of the De Vulgari Eloquentia appear in Canto 31, where Dante encounters the giants. Here, the language itself becomes an incomprehensible jumble of sounds, gibberish that no one can understand. One giant, Nimrod, utters words that no interpreter can decipher. Rafal Mayamek Zabi Olmi, Virgil explains. He is his own accuser. This is Nimrod, through whose ill thought one sole language is not used in the world. Let us leave him alone and not speak in vain, for every language is to him as his is to others, which is known to none. Dante then proceeds to meet other giants, each reinforcing the sense of linguistic chaos and the tragic dislocation of communication. Dante mentions giants, both in Inferno and in the De Vulgari Eloquentia, for a reason deeply tied to perspective. The De Vulgari Eloquentia can be read, in a sense, from Nimrod's viewpoint, because Dante wants to attempt something similar to what Nimrod attempted. Nimrod tried to unify all human languages, and the result was Babel, the confusion of tongues. He sought to build a tower that would reach heaven, a symbol of human pride trying to ascend to the divine, just as the incarnational Word descends to join heaven and earth. Nimrod's ambition represents a desire for a superior perspective, the perspective of a giant, from which he could see the whole world and attempt to transcend human contingency. The theological response, however, is that transcendence is not achieved through pride, but through humility. Pride and perspective are intimately linked. The De Vulgari Eloquentia is also a text of perspectivism. Perspectivism is the acknowledgement of multiple viewpoints, all of which one can understand or control. Dante structures the entire Inferno this way, employing a wide array of styles: the courtly rhetoric of Francesca, the legalistic language of Pier della Vigna, the scholastic speech of Brunetto Latini, and the prophetic language of the seers. He uses all perspectives, making the Divine Comedy itself a perspectivist work. One might object that speaking of perspective in this way imposes a concept foreign to Dante's own culture. It is true that the formal theory of perspective is usually associated with 15th century art. Yet, even before such theory, there existed the practice of perspective. Perspective is often linked to figures like Alberti, who in the year 1436 wrote on painting, De Pictura, theorizing about what painters were doing. For Alberti, perspective meant recognizing that medieval modes of representation lacked depth, assuming that the visible world coincided too neatly with reality. Perspective allows the spectator's position to shape the way the world appears. One can manipulate space visually according to distance, eye position, and even the hour of the day. Renaissance theorists acknowledged that they could only render the appearance of things, not their full reality. This revolutionary understanding of vision and representation illuminates why Dante's work, centuries earlier, already engages with multiple viewpoints and the consequences of attempting to grasp the totality of the world. Dante employs perspectivism, which, again, is a method of assembling multiple points of view, because he believes he has genuinely gathered a variety of vantage points. By the time of his exile in 1302, he has traveled extensively across Italy, and he thinks he can shape the vernacular language of the peninsula. In the De Vulgari Eloquentia, for example, he discusses the proximity of the Romance languages. He observes that French, Provençal, Spanish, and Italian are connected through a single particle, such as the word si, used to make an affirmative statement. This is how these language families are knit together. Dante continues to respond to the story of Nimrod. The line, often thought to be meaningless, Raffle Myamek Zabi Olmi, actually has significance if examined carefully. It functions as an imperfect anagram of a Hebrew line from the Psalms, and the following reference to sweeter psalms suggests that Dante is hinting at his source. The line in Psalm 22, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, is the cry of Jesus on the cross. Father, Father, why have you forsaken me? Dante uses Hebrew deliberately because, as he stated in the De Vulgari Eloquentia, it is a twisted, inverted language, like that of the builder of the Tower of Babel, a language humans are not meant to understand. Yet, behind the confusion, there remains intelligibility. Specifically, this is the tragic moment of the crucifixion, when the Son feels utterly abandoned and perceives the divine order as unresponsive, a moment of profound theological despair. Dante seems to suggest to Nimrod indirectly that, had he understood such language, he might have found a way to reach heaven. Perspectival confusion also arises. Dante, distant from the giants, mistakes them for towers, recalling a famous town that still exists. Travelers near Siena can see the towers of Monteriggioni, which is what Dante envisions when he confuses giants for towers due to his lack of proper perspective. Perspective depends on the distance between observer and object, and involves the basic geometry that underpins the theory of vision. Even when perspective is established, Dante faces further challenges. At the start of Canto 32, he writes that if he possessed harsh and grating rhymes suitable for the dismal pit where all rocks converge, he could express more fully his conception. Since he does not, he speaks with caution, for describing the lowest point of the universe is no task for play or a simple tongue. He calls upon divine aid, likening it to the assistance Amphion received in building the walls of Thebes, so that his account may not depart from reality. He laments the fate of the misbegotten souls in this place, wishing they had been sheep or goats. Here Dante revisits the ineffability topos. As in Canto 28, he confronts a parodic, inverted form of the sublime. The horror he witnesses is so extreme that words and metaphors fail, leaving language unable to fully capture the reality of what he sees. In this passage, Dante is pursuing a style rather than merely words. He understands that this infernal reality demands a unique mode of expression. He cannot rely on the familiar, everyday language of intimacy, the words babbo and mama, the language of children, because he is confronting the treacherous souls who have betrayed their families. The tragic resonance of this setting makes ordinary language inadequate, and perhaps no language at all can fully capture it, since in this realm of treachery and fraud, words and actions no longer align. To meet this challenge, he appeals to Amphion and the story of Thebes. Amphion, a poet who moved stones with the power of his voice, is a version of Orpheus who tamed the savage passions within the human heart, and Dante seeks to emulate him. This is also a retrospective allusion to Dante's own earlier poetry, his rhyme Petrose, written in a period of obsessive devotion to a stone lady, a Donna Petra, whose coldness was imagined to petrify him. He recognizes that this stony style is the only adequate mode for depicting the frozen hardness of hell, where there is no burning fire at its lowest level, only cold, unyielding ice. The icy horror is made fully manifest at the end of the canto. Dante observes two souls trapped in one cavity, so close that the head of one serves as a hood for the other. The upper soul gnaws at the lower one's brain and nape with the same ferocity that Tydeus once devoured Menelaus' temples in rage. Dante addresses them. He asks why they commit such bestial acts and offers to record their grievances in the world above, should justice permit. This scene of cannibalization, one human being consuming another, is among the most unbearable in Inferno, a profoundly tragic image that approaches the limit of what can be expressed. Dante positions the reader at the boundary between speech and the ineffable. This liminal tension continues at the start of Canto 33. The sinner pauses from his savage feast, wiping his mouth on the hair of the victim, and begins to speak. He anticipates reliving desperate grief as he recounts his story, yet his words may serve as a testimony of infamy against the traitor he devours. He speaks and weeps simultaneously. These lines echo the language of Francesca and Paolo in Inferno 5, but here the language of love has been transformed into hatred. Ugolino cannot distinguish between love and hatred, and this blindness is central to his tragedy. He acknowledges Dante's Florentine dialect, noting that the speaker seems familiar, yet there remains no real possibility of communication. Language here functions as a tool to recognize the other, but understanding is still denied. In this passage, Dante employs a rhetorical mode that critics identify as a dramatic monologue. Ugolino speaks uninterrupted, recounting the story of his life as he perceives it, without expecting or receiving any response from his apparent listener. This allows Ugolino to fictionalize himself, convinced that the reality he constructs through his narrative will be accepted as truth. Dante deliberately encourages this self-fictionalization, knowing that in hell, the dead believe that their stories define reality for all. This self-deception, the belief that one's account becomes universal truth, is a recurring theme in this canto. Ugolino begins his autobiographical narrative with a striking line: "You have to know that I was Count Ugolino, and this is the Archbishop Ruggieri." Here, he uses attributes or titles and shifts tense from past to present. By saying, "I was Count Ugolino," while placing Ruggieri in the present, he renders his object of hatred timeless and unchanging, even as his own story unfolds historically. Ruggieri defines him in the present, embodying the secular and the sacred, the ongoing conflict of Guelphs and Ghibellines. Ugolino's story becomes a microcosm of the broader patterns of sin and betrayal witnessed throughout Inferno. He explains that he was imprisoned in a tower, referred to as the Tower of Hunger, which recalls the imagery of other towers, like Babel. Within this tower, he experiences a dream that he mistakenly interprets as prophecy. In the dream, he sees a figure as master and lord, chasing the wolf and the whelps, symbols of the Guelphs and Ghibellines, on a mountain hidden from Pisa's view of Lucca. This vision of destruction mirrors the inevitable mutual annihilation of hunter and hunted. He awakens to his children, crying for food that will never come as the tower is sealed. Stoically, he refrains from weeping. "I did not weep, so was I turned to stone within me. They wept." Yet the pathos persists, accentuated by the tender diminutive Anselmuccio for his young son Anselmo. The horror deepens. "My poor little Anselm said, 'You look so, father, what ails you?' I shed no tear for that, nor did I answer all that day, nor the night after, until the next sun came forth on the world. As soon as a little ray made its way into the woeful prison, and I discerned by their 4 faces the aspect of my own, I bit both my hands for grief. And they, thinking I did it for hunger, suddenly rose up and said, 'Father, it will be far less painful to us if you eat of us. You did clothe us with this wretched flesh, and do you strip us of it?' Then I calmed myself in order not to make them sadder. That day and the next we stayed all silent, a hard earth. When we had come to the 4th day, Gaddo threw himself outstretched at my feet, saying, 'Father, why do you not help me?' There is a strong echo of the prayer of Jesus on the cross in the child's anguished question. The violence inflicted upon Ugolino's children reverberates as a reenactment of the profound drama of Christian sacrifice, blending horror with an unbearable pathos that defines the tragic essence of this canto. Inevitably, one by one, Ugolino's children perish before his eyes, and he recounts, "I took me, already blind, to groping over each, and for 2 days called them after they were dead. Then fasting did more than grief had done." At this point, Ugolino sees nothing, losing all perspective. He can no longer distance himself from events or distinguish between them. The final line, "Fasting did more than grief had done," is profoundly ambiguous, leaving the meaning unresolved. Some, like Rodin, interpret it as Ugolino having eaten his children, yielding to hunger rather than grief. Others suggest he may mean that starvation overcame grief, that he was destroyed by hunger rather than sorrow. Dante leaves this deliberately uncertain, suspending the reader in ambiguity, allowing the tragic power of the scene to emerge precisely in what cannot be known or resolved. Borges's reading emphasizes this suspension. The possibility that Ugolino ate his children is left unresolved, and that uncertainty is essential to the tragic mode. Dante further expresses the tragedy with an apostrophe against Pisa. "Ah, Pisa, shame of the peoples of the fair land where the affirmative is heard, since your neighbours are slow to punish you, let Capraea and Gorgona shift, and make a hedge for Arno at its mouth, so that it drown every soul in you." Here, the affirmative echoes his earlier discussion of language in the De Vulgari Eloquentia, yet its use is bitterly ironic. In the realm of treachery, the most nihilistic sin, which annihilates bonds between people, any affirmation is hollow. The plea recalls Ugolino's own desperate appeals for the earth to open and consume them, blending horror with the poet's recognition that he himself is witnessing a truly catastrophic scene. The vision of hell becomes an apocalyptic reflection of the world Dante knows. The most tragic element emerges clearly in Dante's judgment. For if Count Ugolino had the name of betraying you of your castles, you ought not to have put his children to such torture. The innocence of the children, Uguccione, Brigata, and the others, has been destroyed. Pisa becomes the new Thebes, a site of fresh Thebaid, and the violence echoes the story of the crucifixion. The Christological resonance highlights the depth of the tragedy. Unlike the cross, which redeems and confers innocence through voluntary sacrifice, here the slaughter of innocents achieves no redemption. The act is senseless, reinforcing the futility of human violence. Retrospectively, Dante portrays history and the human condition as governed by tragic inevitability. The law of the world, the patterns of human action, appear absolute and inescapable. This episode stands as one of the darkest, most desperate moments in the poem, revealing the unrelenting weight of cruelty, injustice, and the tragic structure of existence itself. And so, in true tragic fashion, Dante enters the final canto of the first part of his comedy. Canto 34 is where he encounters Satan. Thus, at the exact center of hell, condemned for the ultimate sin of personal treachery against God, stands the devil, whom Virgil names Dis, a title drawn from the Roman god of the underworld and often used in antiquity for Pluto. This supreme traitor, Lucifer, was once held by God to be the most beautiful of the angels, but his pride led him to rebel, and he was cast out of heaven. Now he appears as a monstrous and terrifying creature, immense in size, trapped waist deep in ice, immobilized and endlessly suffering. He bears 3 faces, each of a different color. The central face is red, the one on the right is pale yellow, and the one on the left is black. These faces are joined at the shoulders and reunited at the crown of the head, forming a grotesque parody of unity. Some interpreters have suggested that the 3 faces symbolize dominion over the 3 human races, while all readings agree that they represent a profound distortion of the Trinity. Where God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-loving, Satan is weak, ignorant, and filled with hatred. Lucifer still possesses 6 wings, but they are dark, bat-like, and useless. The violent beating of these wings generates freezing winds that only strengthen the ice that imprisons him. From his 6 eyes he weeps constantly, and his tears mingle with blood and corruption as they spill down his 3 chins. Each face contains a mouth that eternally chews upon a notorious traitor. In the left and right mouths hang Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus, punished for their role in the assassination of Julius Caesar, an act that Dante understood as the destruction of rightful political unity and divinely sanctioned authority. In the central and most cruel mouth is Judas Iscariot, the apostle who betrayed Christ. Judas suffers the most severe torment. His head is gnawed relentlessly, while his back is endlessly flayed by Lucifer's claws. In this way, Judas embodies treachery against God, while Brutus and Cassius represent betrayal against human society and secular rule. This meeting with Satan provides an extraordinary coherence to the entire movement of Inferno. The journey began with the neutral angels, those who had watched the disruption of the cosmos during Lucifer's rebellion against God, and now it concludes with Lucifer himself, giving the work a cosmic and angelic symmetry. Dante's depiction of Satan is striking in its silence. Unlike Milton's Paradise Lost, where Lucifer is a brilliant rhetorician, Dante's Satan does not speak. Some commentators, like T.S. Eliot, have even suggested that first-time readers skip this canto because the silence is so disorienting. Yet, this silence is consistent with Dante's understanding of language in the De Vulgari Eloquentia. Angels do not use human speech, and Satan, as the embodiment of defeated evil, cannot communicate. This canto contrasts sharply with the previous one. In Canto 33, evil appeared sovereign, all-consuming, hovering over all reality. In Canto 34, however, Satan is reduced to a silent, reified object, yet this object serves the pilgrim's journey. Only by passing along Lucifer's body can Dante and Virgil invert themselves and emerge from hell into the light. Satan, in this sense, becomes an instrument for escape, a threshold to transcendence. At around 6 in the evening on Saturday, Virgil and Dante begin their escape from hell by descending feet first along the coarse hair of Satan's body. When they reach his lower body, they pass through the very center of the universe, the point where gravity reverses, moving from the northern hemisphere of land to the southern hemisphere of water. When Virgil changes direction and begins climbing upward toward the surface of the earth, Dante is initially confused and believes they are returning deeper into hell. Virgil explains that the time is halfway between the canonical hours of prime and terce, meaning 7:30 in the morning of the same Holy Saturday that is just ending. Dante cannot understand how, after little more than an hour of climbing, it can already be morning. Virgil clarifies that by crossing the Earth's center into the southern hemisphere, they have entered a region that is 12 hours ahead of Jerusalem, the central city of the northern hemisphere, where it is therefore 7:30 in the evening. The canto also presents a cosmological explanation for the origin of purgatory. Virgil then explains that the southern hemisphere was once entirely covered by dry land, but when Lucifer fell from heaven, the land recoiled in horror and fled northward, leaving the ocean behind. The rock displaced by Lucifer's plunge rushed upward to avoid contact with him, rising into the southern hemisphere to form the mountain of Purgatory. This mountain, the only landmass in those waters, stands directly opposite Jerusalem. Thus, an act of evil becomes the condition for redemption. In Dante's cosmos, no evil is without potential for good. Evil is defeated when it becomes a stepping stone toward salvation, allowing the pilgrim to reach the purgatorial island. The two poets climb through a narrow rocky passage between the frozen floor of Cocytus and the underside of the earth above, moving against the course of Lethe, the river of forgetfulness that flows down from the summit of Mount Purgatory. At last, just before dawn on Easter Sunday morning, they emerge beneath a sky filled with stars. The journey through hell concludes with the famous line, "And thence we issued forth to see again the stars." There is a remarkable symmetry in Dante's work. Each canticle ends with the image of the stars, reminding the reader of the heavens, of perspective, and of the distant light that guides the pilgrim. Like Dante, the reader shifts perspective and moves forward beneath that boundless expanse, looking upward and onward.